Books have always been responsible for connecting the will and determination of people throughout history. Many tyrants have tried to destroy them. There was an expression called Vibio Coast that referred precisely to those books that were burned. Even if they turn to ashes, they will never disappear. Someone will always keep at least one with them and save it from the fire. People buried books in the garden soil to prevent the tyrant's eyes from finding them. The battle between literature and those in power has always occurred. Even to this day, it happens. Regardless of the historical period, books try not to be destroyed by the atrocities of time. One day, a certain boy decided to get involved in this battle. The name of this boy was Ash, and he was 8 years old. Running through the village, he arrived home and shouted for the priest to ask him to let him read a book. Foki quickly recognizes Ash and almost calls him a brat, but the boy doesn't mind being called that at all. After hearing his request, the priest turns to look at the bookshelf behind him and then asks the boy what he intends to do after reading them in such a distant place. Ash understands that it was strange to go so far just for that, but he was doing it for fun. The answer left Foka confused, and the boy tries to explain that it obviously had to be for such a simple reason. The world was too difficult, and if he couldn't enjoy the time he had, then he would go crazy. The day before, the chief's wife had invited the school children to a reading session. It was at that moment that the protagonist understood something. Diving the mind into books can heal hearts, and thus, a vacant and hard-to-live village undoubtedly needed stories to distract the mind. Sighing, Folke gives up on paying attention to the boy's words and questions whether he at least knew how to read. Ash replies that he doesn't, leaving the man in shock. But to begin with, the protagonist intends to learn, and that should be the job of a priest of the church. The boy would become Foka's first student, who came from the royal capital to such a hidden village. Although he saw such determination, the man refuses to teach a child. Despite this, Ash is not disappointed and asks him to at least lend him an easy book. This makes the priest ask if he at least understands how important they were. Ruining or selling them was completely out of the question. The protagonist promises to be careful, even knowing that pages naturally get old over time. The books would degrade and eventually fall apart. This included all those on the shelf in that house, so the number of times they would be used in the future was quite limited. Knowing this, perhaps it was better that they were well used and even stained in the meantime. It didn't take long for folk to realize that this boy liked to talk and show off. This made the boy quite happy with himself. After all, he intended to memorize several new words and always learn. At first, the priest doesn't believe that it would be easy for a child like him to remember so many things at once, but Ash knew it would be a hard task and would need to read several books to get used to it, perhaps putting the words into practice by also learning to write. If that were the case, the man sighs and decides to lend a manuscript he had with him. It wouldn't be a problem if the pages were damaged in some way. All happy, Ash thanks the priest and begins to take a look at what was written. Then, he asks Foka to read it because he intended to memorize it on his own. After grumbling, Foka explains that it was about the powerful wolf god, the wise monkey god, and the fierce dragon king. These were words that prayed to receive the blessings they had available. The boy realizes it was a normal phrase to hear in churches, and with that, the priest puts him out of his house because he wanted to be alone again. Without complaining at all, Ash leaves waving goodbye. He was happy to have taken the first step towards a more fun life. This boy was born in the village of Naskala, a remote and quite distant inland town, but what stood out most about him was having memories of his previous life. The memories were hard to understand and not very clear, so the boy had no idea what kind of person he was in the past. There was only one thing Ash was sure about the situation. The current life was quite inconvenient and poor compared to the previous one. There was no type of technology available or combustion systems, much less horses or fertilizers. Thus, the residents worked hard every day to survive. Although he was only 8 years old now, it didn't take long for the boy to become good at what he did by always working. Despite everything, Ash missed the things that his previous life provided to the point of almost seeming like a lost dream. If anyone let their guard down there, they could starve and die. Living in such a harsh world with so little entertainment was just painful. In the midst of this desperate situation, he finally managed to find his first source of fun. To enjoy each of the available books, Ash would have to learn to read as soon as possible. As soon as he got home, the boy ran to greet his parents and headed straight to his room. To start, he tried to memorize the writing of the 3 gods mentioned by the priest and checked the sentence breaks in the phrases. It was a relief that they were all phonetic alphabets. If he could make the letters correspond correctly, then it would be easy to memorize. Thus, several days passed with Ash studying with great dedication. Even his parents were surprised to see him so obsessed with the books for so long. His mother was happy to see him wanting to learn so much to read. In response, the husband mentioned that it would be appropriate for her to explain to their son that books were useless since men needed to work in the fields and get food. On the other hand, The woman retorted that both were important. Besides, it made her happy to see that Ash was having so much fun recently. After a good amount of time passed, the boy went to visit the priest again and asked to borrow a new book. A month went by, and he thought he had managed to memorize the letters. Folk couldn't believe this was even possible and hoped it was a lie. This reaction left the young man irritated for being underestimated to that extent. So, Ash proposed that if he could learn to memorize the letters, the priest would have to lend him any of the books he wanted in the future. Enjoying the challenge, the man agreed. To prove the result of his efforts, the boy suggested borrowing paper and a pen. He intended to write a contract with his own hands. In it, he would state the fact of the book loan as a penalty for calling Ash a liar. While Folka was confused about why he was going so far, the boy agreed that it wasn't really necessary and would accept an apology. After all, he called a pure-hearted child something so horrible and made him shed false tears. The priest couldn't believe how stupidly clever the protagonist could be for his age. Giving up on resisting, he finally handed over the paper for him to write the contract. As soon as Ash began to write, it became clear that he was not used to using a pen at all. Moreover, the handwriting was ugly and horrible to the point that the words were crooked. When he finished, Folka quickly took the paper to read, still somewhat shocked that the boy had indeed managed to memorize all the letters of the alphabet. He had no idea how it was possible considering that just a few weeks earlier, the boy couldn't read anything. Ash replied that he just remembered the first sentence and applied each of them in the following paragraphs. This was the necessary proof to justify how much he had been able to dedicate himself for so long. For the next book, the boy decided to ask for one about religion or one with easy stories. Even more weeks and months passed with Ash studying every day. Eventually, winter arrived, and one day the boy decided to borrow several at once. Folk reflected that there were even adults incapable of consuming literature as quickly as the boy. It was somewhat frightening to see an 8-year-old boy piling up stacks of pages and writing on his own. It was becoming increasingly obvious that he was not an ordinary child. With Ash's intelligence, he might be able to do something that the priest had dismissed some time ago. So, he stood up and asked the boy to sit down because he wanted to talk about a certain subject. There was a book he would like to see him read using the cleverness he had. Just seeing its cover demonstrated how special it was. Upon opening the first page, the protagonist realized that the writing was different from the usual, being quite disorganized. Seeing the next sentences, Ash feared he wouldn't be able to read them. Some words were similar, but he didn't think any of them made sense. Then Folka explained that this was a copy of a book from ancient civilizations. From the boy's confusion, it was clear that he didn't know what it was about. On the other hand, the young man understood it to be tales of legends from the past. With a calm expression, the priest mentioned that he had always wanted to read that copy while doing research in the capital. For a long time, he spoke with various people who studied the same area and read notes from historians. However, he was unable to read what was written on those pages. Perhaps because he wasn't achieving results, Folka was sent to that remote village. Still, he didn't give up on his own dream. Since then, he spent a lot of money to build a new manuscript and worked on it every day. Ash asks why the man wants to know so much about ancient civilizations, and the priest laughs because this was a mystery to him as well. Deep down, he didn't understand the reason for feeling so curious. The answer to this question might be the same that Ash had given him some time ago. It was all for fun and entertainment. In that case, both agreed that they couldn't stop their studies now that they had begun. At the same time, the boy was surprised to learn that such ancient things exist. Folke understands the feeling and mentions that some tales may be false, although there are real copies scattered around the world, which means that the legendary technologies from a people of the past really existed. Tables full of food, clothes that can be changed every day, medicines that speed up the healing of wounds, and even lamps that shine without the need for fire. There were even mentions of advanced constructions around the world and methods of travel faster than horse races. The life that Ash never thought he would find in this world could be seen narrated in books from the past. What also caught his attention was the possibility that the memories of his former life were linked to this civilization. It was possible that he could discover more about himself in the process. Ancient civilizations exist, and in some books they are described as legends. Their advanced and rich lives are quite real. If he could explore them by reading and understanding the languages of the past, it was possible that they could recover the riches of that time. Thus, Ash was determined to investigate the people of antiquity, to the point of leaving the priest laughing at how reliable he was. Seeing him able to notice the similarities between current writing and what was in the copy was admirable. There were two types of ancient civilizations. The first was called initial, and the other final. The characters that appear in the initial end up reaching the next version, and details about them are even demonstrated in the present. As a result of the passage of time, various people and events were modified. The manuscript that Folka had was an example of what remained from that time. That was why many are unable to understand what was written. In this, the protagonist asks for permission to look at the pages a second time. As imagined, several letters had deteriorated and faded over time to the point of being difficult to define. The ancient people had too many characters, and it was hard to differentiate them. That was when Ash remembered a day when his father talked about marking the end of certain tasks with a specific symbol. That drawing made the fields better and worked like an ancient spell. Coincidentally, the symbol in question also appeared on the pages of the old book. This made the boy wonder what the meaning behind it could be. From all indications, they were not letters that could be read aloud with a sound, but had translation. Perhaps they were ideograms, and Ash stands up to explain to the priest the understanding he had. There was a chance that the ancient people were unable to read and perhaps chose to make drawings to communicate. Folka is confused to hear this, and the boy decides to exemplify by making signs with his hand, as if he were drawing in the air. If he were to put those body movements into writing, then they would be able to translate them into drawings. In this case, it was possible that the words of the past could contain an unknown heap of information by themselves. This analysis left the priest interested and would explain the reason for their difficulty in translating them in the present. At the same time, it meant that the current situation was quite bad. From the priest's happy face, he believed with all certainty that they hit the nail on the head with the interpretation. This was a great discovery that could change the studies of history. Folka shakes Ash by the shoulders and praises him for being so amazing. Although he was happy to see him smile, the protagonist still thought the man was reacting in an exaggerated way. Since then, Folka dedicated much more of his time to studies. If left completely alone, he would end up getting sick, so Ash always checked on him from time to time to ensure he was eating and sleeping. Although he did this, it didn't seem like the priest was listening to the advice. It made sense the amount of effort Folka was putting in considering the low life expectancy in the village. At any moment, someone could die of cold during the cruel winter. Even Ash was in a hurry to learn and live to the fullest, so he got used to reading every day, regardless of not being able to understand what each symbol means. Just spending time dedicating himself to understanding them would make him progress in the research. The only problem was his father, who always complained about being lazy instead of working in the fields. To avoid conflict, Ash gave in to his demands and went out to help him. This time, David, his father, explained that a merchant named Quid came very early to buy the wheat harvest before winter arrived. As soon as they met the merchant, the man chuckled, saying that his ability to escape demons allowed him to survive the journey to the village. The topic made Ash wonder if the creatures mentioned by the adults were real monsters or just an analogy for thieves. Although the boy asked someone, they would always give an ambiguous answer, thinking it was just childish curiosity. Quid noted that the quality of the wheat this time was very good and would buy it for 4 copper coins. That would be around 80 silver, which was enough for David to acquire salts and herbs, as well as grinding stones and fever reducers. The two adults continued doing business until Ash's father noticed a small shiny jar. This was the honey wine that cost 20 silver coins, so it was quite expensive. David even tried to ask for a discount to buy it, until the protagonist interrupted the conversation, reminding them that they needed clothes instead of alcohol, or else their mother would get angry. The merchant laughed at how clever the boy was, and Ash didn't give up, also asking for 2 extra needles and negotiating so well that his father was somewhat surprised to see. Upon realizing that David wanted that wine too much, the seller sighed and decided to give a discount just because they were old friends. The guy lowered the price so much that Ash became worried about the possibility of the merchant losing out. However, the man assured that everything would be fine because sometimes it was necessary to know how to yield and ensure the customer's happiness. On the other hand, this was the kind of item that wouldn't sell well even in the city, and it wouldn't hurt to offer an extra bonus now. Contrary to Quid's expectations, the protagonist commented that he had calculated the price wrong. To sum up, he charged 1 coin more than he should have. If that adult intended to cheat him, then Ash would be forced to go to the church to lament the situation. This way, he could prevent more people from suffering, and certainly, the priest would spread the occurrence to the villagers. As a result, the seller wouldn't be able to negotiate there anymore. But of course, it wasn't a threat. The boy was just explaining the situation in a way that even seemed like he was trying to manipulate him. Everyone can make mistakes, including skilled and experienced merchants. Before Ash, Quid had done the same with others like Joyle and the Hunter Ban. The fact that a child knew so many details left the seller frozen in shock. Quid had always been nice to the villagers and was certainly someone with a good heart, which is why the protagonist promised he wouldn't tell anyone. At least, that was what he would do as long as the man promised to be honest and earn his trust again. Somewhat startled by the boy's cleverness, the seller stammered his thanks for the understanding and even offered a compensation for the mistake made. In this case, the gift was a very nice and somewhat expensive fabric that would make his mother happy. Now Ash had managed to negotiate, and certainly, Quid would become someone trustworthy. All that mattered was getting goods at a fair price. After finishing the business, David called his son so they could go back home. The three said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. Back at the church, Ash went to check if the priest was eating properly. These questions were making Folka a bit irritated because the boy could be more persistent than a wife. Besides, the boy acted with too much confidence, getting involved in adult matters. Ash retorted that the fact a child cared about Folka should make him reconsider his own behavior. At least he had to try to seem like a worthy adult. Changing the subject, it didn't seem like the reading of the old books had progressed much. In a way, Folka at least identified certain names that appeared frequently. If there was one in particular that repeated enough, they would be able to understand it. This time, Ash intended to borrow books too. Read just as they had decided when contracted. The protagonist's desire was to enjoy some tales this time. It would be nice to get some general education ones too so he could gather more information about the world. After picking up the copies, Ash decided to leave to read in the cathedral. There were several travel diaries that seemed interesting, but the technical ones focused on agriculture and harvests could help him with his studies. It was possible that some of them also had information passed down through generations. On one page, the protagonist noticed writings from botanical guides and wondered if any plant he knew had benefits. While he was busy, suddenly a girl enters the church asking for permission and greets him. This girl always noticed how strange Ash was as a child, always calm and spoke with more maturity than some adults in the village. From her point of view, he was the kind of person who was always laughing, but never honestly. That's why the girl was surprised when she saw him running to the church with a huge, sincere smile on his face. That was a place focused on studies, but the priest had always been a grumpy man. She had never seen anyone spend so much time in the cathedral, possibly because most adults were busy in the fields. Even so, the protagonist was visiting the church every day. This made her wonder how it was possible for someone to enjoy learning so much. The girl herself hated going to school and didn't understand how spending time with her face in books could be fun. Seeing Ash show a real smile worries her. After all, she couldn't take her eyes off his face since then. Without thinking much, she ended up entering the cathedral out of pure curiosity. As soon as she saw him, Ash greets Micah and notices her staring at the books on the table. Nervous for being caught staring, she tries to explain herself, and the boy tells her what he had been doing for some time. The point was that Ash was having a lot of fun there. Changing the subject, he assumes that Micah visited the church to find the priest and guides her to the back room. Folka appears to greet her, and for the first time in his life, he was kind. Even the protagonist noticed the change in his behavior and realized he was the only one receiving rude words and looks. Finally, Micah mentions that she was thinking about learning to write too. Of course, Folka quickly noticed the girl's true interest in keeping Ash company and laughed at the adorable scene. The protagonist remembers that this girl was the mayor's daughter, so her interest in studying made sense. The literacy rate in the village was almost zero, the only exception being the Klein family, who could read, write, and do calculations. It was possible that the girl had noticed Ash's constant visits to the church, and that's why she decided to keep him company. Yuika, Klein's wife, was the person who showed the protagonist the beauty of books. She was the woman who showed him that there was still hope in life. Without that reading session they had, Ash had no idea what would have happened to his future. Folka was willing to teach Micah too, but he wouldn't be able to do it all the time since he was busy with other tasks. In that case, he passes the teaching work in his free time to Ash, arguing that they were of similar ages and would get along well. The protagonist immediately feels confused, but Micah immediately is pleased with the proposal. The two decided this without even asking Ash's opinion. On the other hand, the priest tries to convince him to teach the girl. After all, she was smart and his #1 student. Successfully convincing him, Folka returns to his room to continue working, all happy. And it didn't take long for Ash to assume it was the man's way of pushing his own responsibilities onto others, which makes him sigh. Although it was unfair, it wasn't like the protagonist could abandon Micah when she seemed so eager to study. In the end, having company during readings could be fun. Thus, he guides her to sit at the table so they can start. The girl is curious about the book her friend was studying a little earlier, and he tells her it's about scriptures that Folka occasionally uses in festivals and ceremonies. Considering they were words Micah had heard in the past, it might help her learn more quickly. At first, the protagonist doesn't know how to start teaching her, so the girl asks what the first thing he learned was. In that, Ash tells her it was about the wolf, monkey, and dragon gods. Being scriptures that the vast majority knew, It would be easy to use them again for studying. The boy starts pointing to each letter and explains what each part means, but Micah can only stare at his face. After he notices his classmate's distraction, the girl quickly tries to focus on studying. The first one was Takuma, the wolf god, also known as a shiki. They said he had a strong and healthy body, so humans pray to him when children are born or during manual work. Micah comments that she understands what the word strength means now, and so the protagonist realizes they would have to start from an even more basic point than he expected. Then, he explains that this term also applies to when people have great determination, as if it were resilience. As soon as the girl gets nervous, Ash asks her not to worry and to ask whenever she has doubts. So, they proceed to talk about the monkey god, where the representation of the wise symbolizes intelligence. When someone studies this way, they should pray to this entity for it to share its intelligence. Thus, Micah agrees and suggests they pray together. Ash is pleased to have put a smile on her face and feels that at this pace they could easily move on to the next stages of reading. Time passes, and the duo continues to learn side by side. Even Folka noticed they were excited since it was the first day of studies, but it was getting late, and it was better to head home before it got too dark. Micah feels a bit sad about having to leave while it was still night. Then the protagonist suggests accompanying her even though they live in different directions. After all, he couldn't let a girl go home alone like that. Even the priest praises him for being such a gentleman and laughs at the boy's face. The children leave the church and make their way back to the village. Along the way, Micah compliments her friend for being able to learn so quickly, even though they are the same age. In fact, this only happened because Ash has memories from his previous life. However, this was a hard fact to believe, and he didn't know what others would think if he told someone about this detail. They might call him crazy or weird because of it. So Ash changes the subject and comments that Micah is also learning at a good pace. At this rate, the two would be on the same level in terms of talent in no time. During the walk, the boy holds Micah's hand to prevent her from tripping on a stone and falling. It was darker than usual, so it would be more appropriate to walk hand in hand. It would be terrible if she got hurt. After all, she was an important person. Micah feels all embarrassed to hear this, but Ash was just referring to the fact that she is the mayor's daughter. Changing the subject, the girl asks about the other book her friend was carrying, and he explains that it is about trees and plants. It was the kind of reading that is quite useful and interesting. It was part of a special guide that explains which herbs are edible and how to use them to create remedies. If they find the ingredients described there, they would be able to create delicious meals and even increase the number of medicines. Micah is impressed by how amazing books can be, and the protagonist agrees, stating that having them would always allow them to make good use of their time and entertain themselves. There were several other books in the church, and the boy is sure his friend would enjoy getting to know them. After some more time walking, the duo approaches the mayor's house. Micah thanks him for keeping her company and says goodbye, not believing that Ash had been holding her hand the whole time so calmly. Oblivious to her thoughts, the boy simply walks away, reflecting that he would love to see more content from the botanical guide that night. The next day, with pleasant weather and equipment ready, the protagonist decided to make good use of his free time. This time, his goal was to gather wild plants for the first time. The children were gathered in the forest, and as usual, they should avoid going out alone since there had been reports of bears in the deeper areas, and they needed to be careful. Micah ran to Ash as soon as she saw him and noticed how motivated he was. As expected, he intended to use what he learned from the botany books to explore the local plants. There were some similar ones in the pages he knew, and the boy would love to test the effectiveness of each one. The one that interested him at the moment was a particular type of grass. Interrupting the conversation, a boy named Jekyll approaches, dragging the protagonist by the wrist so they would all be in the same search group. Ash points in a certain direction where they had found several ferns the previous year. With that, he had to say goodbye to Micah, who was working with a different group. A little later, the trio of children finds the plants they were looking for. They gather to quickly collect them. Ash knew it was important to pick all possible wild types he encountered, just as the botanical guide said. Looking over a tree, the boy spots another plant that catches his attention. By the shape of the leaves, it seemed to be an aloe vera. They were good for wounds, stomach issues, skin, and also in meals. It would be of great utility in this new life, and also a valuable discovery. While reflecting on its uses, suddenly a loud noise catches his attention. In the blink of an eye, Ash loses consciousness and wakes up after falling in some other place. The boy takes a moment to remember what he was doing just a little while ago. There was blood coming from his head, probably because he hit it during the fall. It was hard to remember the events correctly. It felt like he had been wandering alone in the forest for a long time. However, somehow, he managed to awaken in an unknown place. This situation was a complete disaster. Still, Ash had to find a way to return to the village. Thus, he would continue to help the priest decipher the ancient texts and teach Micah to read and write again. It was his desire to keep learning more stories of this world. At all costs, the protagonist was determined to go home. To start, he checks the direction of the sun and remembers that heading north would take him to the village. Saying it out loud clears his mind and calms him, assuring him that he would survive. The sun was beginning to set, and it would become more dangerous as night fell. Therefore, the best course of action would be to give up on reaching it today and opt to spend the night in the forest. Fortunately, the boy's current belongings were good enough to allow him to gather resources. To begin with, he needed to create light with a campfire before the sun disappeared on the horizon and find a water source if possible. With this in mind, he starts collecting pieces of wood and some herbs that might be useful. Along the way, Ash discovers another aloe vera and is surprised to find it in such a place. This almost calms him more, as it resembled where he was when he fainted. For now, the boy approaches to collect some leaves from the plant. However, what immediately catches his attention is the sound of running water. Following the noise, he soon discovers a nearby river. He would love to hydrate himself now, but even though the water looks clean at first glance, he couldn't take the risk. The safest option would be to boil the water, but unfortunately, he didn't have any pot to put the water in. If options ran out, then Ash would have to surrender to the chance of drinking it as it was. For now, he decides to spend the night right there and prepares the campfire. The idea was to use the aloe vera to heal his wounds and take care of the injuries on his head later. As time passes and night falls, the protagonist feels relieved to have managed to settle in safely and acquire light and warmth. As soon as he used the plant on the open wounds, he felt relief from the pain. The gelatinous part of the aloe vera might even be edible, especially when eaten raw, which would help quench his thirst. At the same time, he managed to catch some sari, and after washing it in the river and cooking it, he was able to eat it. Somehow Ash would manage to spend the night even on an empty stomach. He really missed meat now. If only he had found some animal like a snake, then he could have cut off its head and drunk its blood. Depending on the situation, he could have enjoyed the meat without suffering from the poison. As he thought about this, gradually, the boy falls asleep. The next day, Ash wakes up with a sore body after spending the night on the ground, hungry and thirsty. Although he couldn't leave now, it would be possible to survive by drinking from the aloe vera for now, but he needed to find suitable water soon. Despite being a plant that brings various benefits, a diet consisting solely of it could harm the body. There were other herbs in the forest that could offer water as well, but the best option would still be to boil the water from the river for consumption. When he picks up the botany book for more references, something catches his attention. It was possible to create pots made of paper that could be effective for quick use. Even when burned, the material wouldn't turn to ash and would keep the water inside boiling. It should be possible to substitute the paper with leaves, considering they were harder to burn. With this in mind, the boy quickly walks around to prepare the pot. To his surprise, the water was indeed boiling inside it without burning. After letting the drink cool, Ash took the opportunity to consume it, now safely. It was a great relief to enjoy so much potable water at once after feeling constant thirst. As for food, he soon found some fish making noise in the river. They were safer to eat than random plants, considering he had fire to roast them. Using the basket in hand to catch them, the protagonist spends some time fishing and then prepares his first meal. Now that he had supplies for a while, he would probably avoid death. Knowing this made him calmer and more comfortable in the forest. Ash decides that he would gather more food and water to stock up before trying to make his way back to the village. Amid his thoughts, some noises in the forest grow louder and louder. When the boy least expects it, the figure of someone approaches from behind him. Meanwhile, Yuiko went to visit Folka to bring food. The priest thanked for the help they had been offering for so long. Recently, the man had been taking good care of Micah, and the woman was very grateful, as studies were an important part for the family head of the village. Moreover, she noticed that Folka had a better expression lately, and perhaps it was because Ash had been visiting the church. As the priest tries to change the subject, suddenly Micah rushes into the room calling for her mother. The woman is startled to see her daughter arrive in such a hurry, shouting, and asks if she had finished picking the vegetables. Ignoring her mother's questions, the girl asks what she should do now. After all, Ash had not returned from the forest, and everyone was worried. Micah explains that before she knew it, her friend had disappeared. The first to notice his absence was Jekyll, who had been on Ash's team. Some tried to say they should search the back of the forest to find him, but it was very dangerous, and there could be creatures, so they decided to return to the village to ask for help. At that moment, Micah was desperate, not knowing what they should do to help the missing boy. She was very afraid that something would happen to him and began to cry. Then Yuika hugs her daughter and tries to calm her down, saying that everything would be fine and they would go in search of Ash. Seeing all this, the priest's body tenses, and he stands up before trying to cheer up Micah as well. He states that it would be a waste to cry so much now when they could do that after Ash returned safely. It was obvious that the boy would come home considering how smart he was. After managing to calm her down, all the adults gather in the center of the village to discuss the search. It had been 3 days since the protagonist disappeared. The investigation had been interrupted as it was very hard to imagine that he would still be alive at this point. Yuika approached Folka to alert him that they were thinking of starting a funeral for the boy. The priest asks if they would really proceed this way considering they hadn't even made a decision yet. The woman feels the same. She didn't want to give up on such a young life, but they had searched too vast an area by this point. Since they couldn't find him and Ash was completely alone, they could only suppose that he had fallen victim to the creatures of the forest. After hesitating for a moment, Folka mentions that he wouldn't mind holding the funeral separately, but there was a chance the boy might show up. If that happens, then everything would be fine, and they could forget this mess. At the same time, Yuika asks the man to avoid voicing these concerns out loud, especially to Ash's parents, who were suffering so much. David and Sheila were enduring an enormous pain right now. The choice to hold the funeral on their own was a difficult one to make. However, he didn't believe that Ash was dead. He should certainly be using the botany book he took with him to survive. Folka wanted to believe in that hope within him and wait for the boy's return. Remembering his enthusiasm and intelligence, the man asks Yuika to wait a little longer. Somehow he felt as if the boy could really come back, and suddenly, Ash appeared in the village, not understanding anything that was happening. Everyone looked at him in shock, and immediately David and Sheila ran to hug him. They couldn't stop crying from how worried they had been. Around them, everyone whispered to each other about the boy's return. Ash was confused and asked what all this was about. The priest laughed, all convinced, realizing that his expectations were correct, as the boy questioned the reason for this chaos. Folka explained that it was about the funeral they had been planning for him. Ash screamed in shock and couldn't understand why they had gone so far after just 3 days. The boy's parents scolded him for being so calm while the priest continued to laugh loudly with relief at how funny his shock was. Finally, Micah approached the protagonist and asked if it was really him standing in front of her. Ash assured her it was, that he was there and safe, although tired from being away from home for so long. In tears, the girl shouted and called him an idiot for being the only one who seemed fine while everyone was suffering during his absence. At the same time, she was very relieved to see him safe. The boy apologized and didn't know what to do now that he saw his friend crying. Folka praised Ash for being such a brave guy and surviving so long outside. In that, the protagonist began to tell how he survived in the forest. While feeding on fish, that dark figure from before revealed itself as Ban, the hunter from the village. It turned out that the two sat in front of the campfire in silence. As usual, that man was quiet and didn't respond more than necessary. Ban was the only hunter in the village and always traveled alone to the depths of the forest as a specialist in the area. He was the type to get straight to the point and brusque, making children and even adults see him as someone frightening. Ash lets out a sigh, and the hunter asks what's wrong. Finally, the protagonist apologizes and explains that it feels strange to be alone in a place like this. To simplify, he was in an emergency situation, and that's why the boy asks if Ban could take him back to the village. After a moment, he agrees, and it was a relief for Ash now that he would be accompanied by an experienced adult. And that's how the two were crossing the path together, safely returning to the village. It was a bit difficult because several things happened, but thanks to Ban, they were able to gather medicinal herbs and food. On the other hand, both Micah and Sheila scold the protagonist for being so happy while everyone else was dying of worry. Ash apologizes several times, easing the tense atmosphere a bit. A few days passed after the boy's near funeral took place. In the midst of this, the protagonist saw some angry adults reprimanding Jekyll for some reason. Apparently, he was responsible for pushing Ash from a high place as a bad joke, which was why he fell into an unknown place and got hurt so badly. Later, Ban went to the forest and examined the footprints left behind at the site, discovering to whom they belonged. Although Jekyll always looked at Ash with disdain, the protagonist himself didn't mind so much. At the same time, excessive teasing like that could lead to disasters. At first, he thought that holding a funeral just 3 days after the disappearance was an exaggeration. But if it had been another child in his place, they would hardly have survived. Putting the tension aside, spending time with Ban was a valuable experience. He was a skilled hunter who single-handedly provided food for the village, and among the tasks he was responsible for, it also included dealing with dangerous animals. But it wasn't just that, as the protagonist was surprised to discover that this man was very good at recognizing and gathering plants. With Ban's help, Ash would be able to increase his own knowledge and conduct his own research efficiently. As a result, the protagonist decided to ask the hunter to take him on as his disciple, and the man agreed to the idea. After that, the days in the village continued as usual. Ash learned various things from Ban and continued with his botanical research. Aloe vera was the first on the list. Since he had used it to heal wounds and for food, the boy noticed how useful it was to have it in his previous life. The experiments he conducted included using the plant on the cuts of the rats, checking how quickly the wounds healed. By making observations, he was able to understand that the area of application, amount, and duration of use made all the difference in using aloe vera. As the tests progressed, Ash was able to improve his workspace. In this, taking notes using pen and paper became necessary, and then he decided to negotiate with Quid again. Considering how scared the merchant had been since the other threat, he managed to get results quite quickly this time. That said, Quid understood that the boy wouldn't have money to pay for everything at once and agreed to wait. On top of all that, there was that rat that Ash kept with him as a valuable partner in the experiments. His name was Guinea Pig, and just one look would make it clear that this animal was not a pet. At the moment, the boy was testing the medicinal effects of aloe vera but would eventually have to conduct other experiments. Instead of feeling bad for using the rats, Ash actually saw them as enemies. In this world, people were always starving, and those rodents often stole from the crops and disrupted harvests. Both for vital experiments and to prevent pests, the protagonist decided to use them as targets without thinking twice. He himself hated those animals so much that he didn't even feel bad about making them suffer a little. Thanks to the daily tests, the boy was now able to understand several important things about aloe vera. In summary, it had various positive effects. It was still necessary to discover which of the benefits could translate from a rat to the human body. In that case, it would be necessary to test them on himself from now on. The healing effects are quick to verify, and for now, Ash decided to use it as a balm. After applying it to one hand and leaving the other bare, it was just a matter of time to see the results. As expected, the aloe vera left the skin smooth and clean to the point of eliminating all imperfections. The boy had tested it before with the guinea pig, but it was good to see positive results on the human body. In this, Sheila appears asking her son to help collect water. As soon as the woman saw the boy's shiny hand, she approached to ask how that happened. After all, she remembered that Ash's skin had always been as rough as hers. Then the boy tells her about his experiments with aloe vera, and as one could see, it was quite effective. Sheila couldn't believe there were products like that and immediately became interested in getting some for herself. She was so excited that she didn't care much about the details of it being just an experiment. As soon as Ash handed her some aloe vera, the woman was amazed at how pleasant it was to have smooth, hydrated hands. The happiness made the protagonist realize he never expected to make her so happy. If it was to please his mother, then maybe he could make an even bigger batch as a gift. In fact, he considered that other people in the village might be interested in the products too. Not just women, but men and children had rough hands. It was possible that this small experiment he did with aloe vera could help improve the lives of the villagers. As expected, the balm proved to be very effective, and it didn't take long for Sheila's hands to be hydrated again. Moreover, it ended up attracting more interest than expected from people. Fortunately, Ash managed to get more people to test the products, and thus the progress of the study accelerated. Although he had come this far, it still wasn't enough for the boy. He believed he could go much further and felt that there would even be those willing to pay for the products. So, Ash considered the idea of discussing it with Quid so he could sell outside the village. The reselling would allow him to improve not only his own life but also those of the other villagers. To acquire even more products and useful equipment, he would have to continue gaining knowledge from books. That day, he spent some time at the church studying, and Micah came to see him. He showed her the cover of the book so she could discover it for herself. Successfully reading, the title said, Livestock Manual. Although Micah was happy to improve her reading, she asked why he had a sudden interest in the topic, and the boy explained that he was studying meat and food stocks. If the aloe vera was a success, then he would be able to make money. He had been thinking about using the procedure and trying to start a new business in the village, but the research he did said that working with livestock was not easy at all. The list of expenses only grew the more he reflected on it. Chickens were easy to care for, but their noises attracted the attention of wolves and demons in the forest. Raising them in a cramped environment would be difficult, plus those creatures called demons were very different from common animals. Folk once said that a raid by those monsters in the distant past wiped out an entire civilization. It only made Ash wonder what exactly those beings were. For now, the plan was to buy iron to create tools, and he was considering other types of options as well. Micah was amazed at how admirable her friend was and was seriously thinking about it. Although the protagonist didn't see himself as worthy of so much praise for not having even started yet, the girl praised him for doing such incredible things so far. She even showed how her hands were soft after using the balm. Then, Ash leaned in to touch her fingers and asked how she felt now that she was using the products. But Micah was so embarrassed that she could barely respond. Noticing this, the boy stepped back and apologized for doing something so rude. Although she was young, Ash knew he should be polite and ensure he treated her well as a lady deserves. Changing the subject, Micah mentioned that she didn't feel pain or the scratches from before on her skin. Even her mother had no issues using the cream, so only praises spread about the new creation. The two spent some more time studying together. In parallel, Yuika was shocked to see that Ash had discovered a new type of medicine. Not only that, but he was able to rediscover a technology from ancient civilizations. In general, this was the work of researchers from the church who were serving in the capital. It was unbelievable that such a young boy had so much talent. It almost seemed like some kind of bad joke seeing it that way. However, she herself had seen the effects of the balm and how effective it was on the skin. The village had never had a single specialized product, but suddenly someone forged something that didn't even exist in the largest city of the kingdom. They had always been trying to do the best they could using the village's limited resources to help the new generation. With that in mind, the discovery of a product using aloe vera was impressive. This medicine would attract attention and bring all kinds of people, including those who disapproved of Ash's achievements. Yuika knows she had to take the initiative and prevent the boy and the other villagers from getting hurt. For now, she decides to invite the boy for dinner so they can discuss that creation. If everything goes well, it could be the turning point that changes everyone's life there. Later, Ash received the dinner invitation and happily visited the mayor's house. Micah was the one who welcomed him, dressed in cute clothes and acting as the hostess. The boy complimented her without a second thought, which made her embarrassed but happy. On the other hand, he himself was also in formal attire. The protagonist remembers his parents desperately trying to make him wear those pieces to ensure he had a good image now that he was called to a formal event. Anyway, Yuika appears and compliments the boy's appearance. The family invites him in and takes him to the table, where the meal was served. The mayor's wife quickly asks Ash not to hold back and eat while it was still hot. It didn't take long for her to be surprised by how polite the boy was and how well he behaved at the table. Embarrassed, the protagonist explains that he just wanted to follow the example. Besides, the food was delicious, and as always, Yuika's work in the kitchen was admirable. He even jokes that he was envious of Klein, which makes the two adults laugh. Putting the small talk aside, Ash observes that Yuika was indeed more elegant and refined than most of the other women in the village. It makes sense considering she wasn't originally from there. Having been born and raised as the daughter of an influential family in the capital, it turns out that the current village chief traveled to become an apprentice and ended up falling in love with that woman, then asked her to marry him. There was also some kind of heroic tale in the mix, but the protagonist never heard much about it. As soon as dinner was over, Yuika mentions that she would like to borrow some of his time to discuss something. It was about the aloe vera that became quite famous in the village. She heard that Ash intended to start selling it with quid and was worried. Although she knows that this medicine could be well received, it was possible that the boy might end up distancing himself from his family by being too busy with business. The protagonist understands the situation and knows that having a clear difference in wealth could cause problems within the village. The way he says this makes Yuika comment on how the boy had an advanced vocabulary and knowledge. He was indeed mature for his age. Ash laughs and replies that it was thanks to the teachings of the priest, hiding that deep down he was a reincarnated person, and this was a convenient excuse for now. The woman was sure that the priest would be proud to have such a boy as a student. Then, she mentions that she discussed Ash's new job with Klein, and they both think it was an admirable decision and effort. But to ensure that nothing goes wrong later, the woman would like to offer ideas as well, and the boy agrees, thanking her for the offer, as he wanted to avoid causing more problems in the village. At the same time, he hadn't thought of anything so forward-related. To his project, wasting personal money had never been part of the plan, but if it ended up drawing attention in the village, it could generate some kind of envy. If that were the case, then he would have to save up to get the expensive items later. While he reflected on this in silence, Micah exclaimed, asking her mother to stop bothering her friend. Ash knew he wasn't being mistreated, but it was an expected reaction from a child who saw her friend with a worried face during the conversation. In light of this, Yuka laughs and asks if her own daughter dares to question her. What surprises the protagonist is the villainous smile of the woman and how it suited her. It was almost adorable. The two continue to argue while the boy thinks about the situation. If the mayor's wife had never intervened, then he would have ruined the good relationship he had with others in the village. In the meantime, Micah continues to defend the protagonist and talks about how much he has been working hard recently. The friend was always thinking about the good of the village and was an incredible person. The girl makes a point of shouting this very loudly. This makes Ash give an embarrassed laugh, and eventually Micah realizes that she ended up praising the boy too much. In the end, Klein takes his daughter and leads her to rest after she almost faints from so much embarrassment. The protagonist comments that he still doesn't understand the discussion between the two until now, and Yuika laughs because she just finds her daughter adorable when she gets like that. Anyway, the two return to discussing the important matter. Yuika questions what would be done about the profits made from the medicines, and the boy explains that life in the village was difficult, so he would like to do his best to ease everyone's tasks. That was why he needed new tools and livestock, which made the woman assume that buying things with quid might be enough to help solve the food problem. This action should provide some relief, at least for Ash and his family. On the other hand, it wasn't enough to satisfy him compared to the many wonders he had in his previous life. He didn't need to achieve the best status quo. He just intended to ensure that everyone there had the basic necessities to survive in good conditions. At the moment, this was an idea that only existed within the pages of a fantasy book. But if he wanted to turn this into reality, then he would have to rely on society as a whole. If that wasn't enough, he would hire several people to help him, no matter if it was 100 or 1,000. This dream might seem impossible now, but he still wanted to do his best to achieve it. Thus, Ash was not satisfied with the current situation and shared all this with the woman in front of him. The goal was never to play at being a saint, but he believed it was possible to make everyone happy. To do so, acquiring certain luxuries would be necessary. The boy talked about his dream of creating a life similar to that found in books, rich and full of conveniences. This was once known by ancient civilizations. Getting new clothes, sewage for water, stable light, and various other technological means that would change everyone's lives. At the moment, the protagonist had nothing in hand besides the basics like design and functioning. Discovering such inventions, obtaining materials, and producing would be a long and difficult process alone. That was why he needed help and would be counting on the offer made by Yuika. If she was still willing to lend him a hand, then he would gladly take it. For a greedy dreamer like him, this would change everything. That said, he mentioned that he intended to donate whatever was necessary to the village in exchange for support with the aloe business. Yuika was impressed by how interesting that child was and could almost find him a bit scary too. That said, the woman expressed her gratitude for finding such a talented inventor with great potential for the future. The two shook hands and finished negotiating. Ash was deeply grateful to have someone like Yuika to support him. Now that he had made his case to the village chief, dealing with quid would be much easier and he would be able to make connections with other cities. For now, the goal would be to improve the recipe to make the balm and sell it on a large scale. If this helped improve everyone's quality of life, then he couldn't settle for the minimum. At the very least, this was the first step to take an even bigger one in the future. To that end, he would read book after book and follow the path until he could achieve the life he so desired. On another afternoon, the protagonist visits the mayor's house again to deliver the aloe recipe they discussed the other day. Yuika checks the ingredients and notes that the process to create the medicine was less complicated than expected. The boy soon hands over a small stock of what was needed to make it, and just happened to have gathered more of them while walking through the forest with Ban the other day. He was so prepared that he left Yuka worried about having so many things from the boy, but Ash was willing to rely on the woman as much as possible because he was aware that he couldn't manage everything alone. More importantly, he had faith in the new ally and was sure that everything would work out. Obviously, the protagonist intended to do his best as well. These words made Yuika laugh a little, and she decided to try to prepare a new sales plan. To start, she would prepare some balms on her own and check how many ingredients were used per unit. This reminded her that Micah was also interested, and probably the girl would love to help. Besides, Ash was the reason the girl was able to learn to read and write. On the other hand, the protagonist didn't feel worthy of praise and believed that all this happened thanks to Micah's efforts. Without a doubt, Yuika considered the protagonist intelligent, but still hadn't noticed her daughter's feelings. In any case, the woman decided that she would send some of the medicines to the parents who lived in the capital. This was an excellent idea, and the boy quickly agreed to the proposal. She would report the progress of things as time went by. Meanwhile, Ash decided that he could start studying rodenticide to protect the stocks from rats. Soon, the autumn season would arrive, and as time passed, good sales of the balms were reported. In the meantime, the protagonist's new work resulted in acquiring pieces of bronze. According to Yuika, the sales were made in the high-class district of the capital where her parents lived, and it became a rare and exclusive item to acquire. The boy never dreamed he would be able to acquire so much so quickly. Moreover, a single piece of bronze he received as payment was enough to pay for a quarter of wheat in winter. At this rate, it means he would be able to pay quid for the products he bought on credit before. When the merchant saw the boy trying to settle the accounts, he refused to accept money and asked Ash to use the amount for other things. It seems that selling balm opened doors to negotiate with wealthy families, and as a result, Quid made great sales. Since the man did not accept the money, and giving it to his father would only lead him to get drunk spending it, he decides to take the piece of bronze to the priest. The protagonist explains that it would be a donation that he could withdraw whenever he wanted, although it seems more like a deposit than anything else. Seeing that Folko was not very much in favor of the idea, the boy suggests they could keep the money as mutual research funds. This time, the priest became interested because they could use the investments to read more about ancient languages. Who appeared in the church was Micah, and soon Folka pushed Ash to help her with the day's studies. The two children were left alone after being practically expelled from the man's room. Then, the girl comments that her mother wants to make more aloe vera medicines because they sold well. Apparently, other people in the village were willing to help create a larger and faster production, and the protagonist responds that he was fine with the idea. After all, the woman was his new business partner. On another day, a group gathered at the mayor's house, and Yuika thanked everyone for attending. To start, she would explain the process of creating the balm so that everyone could put the teachings into practice. She decided to increase the production time, and since it was a manual process, hiring other people to assist them was the best course of action. The choice of helpers was made with those who had the most financial problems in mind. The chosen workers were from households that had lost their provider or had family members who were ill. All the selected ones were women who would not be missed in fieldwork. It was a very smart choice on the part of Ash's ally. While Father Folka was a great academic scholar, Yuika was good at management. The first step to achieving the group's goal would be to conduct the practical session. Since none of the recruits were literate, they would take care to teach them to read while learning the recipe at the same time. Ash also attended to help the women during the process of creating the medicine. One of the recruits was Tanya, who preferred to be called just Tanya. The protagonist offers help if she encounters problems in the creation process, and the woman confesses that she was unable to read what was written on the paper. Thus, she would have difficulty understanding everything she had to do. In light of this, the boy was willing to explain everything that was necessary. In this, Tanya observes that both Ash and Micah learned to read in church. Realizing that the children had worked so hard, the woman feels willing to try as well. With that, the protagonist helps her understand what was written and shows her the step-by-step. Later, the women managed to finish making the balm for the first time. Yuika praises everyone for their performance, and even though it was just a first practice, they would certainly be able to create more medicines in the future. The woman recommends the workers to repeat the process at home and use the product as it would help keep their skin hydrated and clean. Tanya observes the result of the day's efforts and comments that it reminds her of something her mother used to do. Immediately, Ash questions what that means, which slightly startles her due to how quickly the boy showed interest. Then she tells about her mother being used to making ointment-like medicines to apply to the body. They used to use it as a remedy for wounds and also to help with rough skin. The ingredients were different from aloe vera, and Ash becomes even more interested in knowing what was used in the production. Apparently, what caught Tanya's attention the most back then was the honeycomb. Her mother used honey itself for cooking, while the honeycomb became part of the medicine. She also remembers other ingredients being mixed in, but not exactly which ones they were. This account makes Ash consider what this ointment could be, and realizes he has no idea what it was. On the other hand, the honeycomb itself was as full of nutrients as the honey alone, so it was obvious that the remedy must be something that takes a lot of time to create. Although she was interested in the details of this, there was no way to know more information from Tanya. Her parents had passed away, and that was the main reason Yuika had hired her. Tanya was left behind with her younger brother Jiggle, and they had to learn a lot of things on their own to survive. The harsh life in the village was the only thing they should blame in this situation. Perhaps the advanced technologies from ancient civilizations were destined to disappear over time. After telling about the medication, Tanya apologizes for not knowing the details, as she would have loved to help her mother more with the honeycombs in the past. Ash doesn't mind this, and mentions that honey was not only delicious, but rich in nutritional value, and just knowing they could create remedies with it was good enough. Yuika agrees because beekeeping was essential for the industry. In the past, Tanya's parents not only sold honey, but also produced candles, and the business helped the village a lot. The topic ends up sparking the idea of starting to work in this area as well. The next step to improve the quality of life in the village would be this. The problem was that Ash didn't find anything about this in the church books, and there was no way for a child like him to learn about it without this means. This conversation reminds Tanya that her father had a rather valuable book at home with a picture of a honeycomb, so it might be useful. Hearing this immediately makes Ash and Yuika interested and grateful that they could obtain such an item so quickly. Tanya feels a bit nervous because her parents' house was still somewhat messy, but the protagonist doesn't mind that at all. He was being so insistent that Yuika had to warn him not to scare the woman. Perhaps it would be better to get the book another day. Although Ash was eager for it, he ends up agreeing with a sad sigh, and immediately he suggests that he could at least read it outside the house. The boy was so willing to gain knowledge that he could go so far as to do anything to earn Tanya's permission. After all this, the woman ends up giving in and guides him to her own house, with Ash happily following her, glad to have convinced her. The others who stayed behind comment among themselves that they always thought the protagonist was calm and quiet, but they just discovered that this first impression was not true. A little later, Ash, accompanied by Micah, arrived at the place where they obtained Tanya's father's book. On its cover, it stated that it was about practical techniques for beekeeping. It described types of honeycombs and cultivation methods, including details for temperature, how to collect, how to handle daily tasks, and much more. The amount of information there exceeded the boy's expectations. Moreover, the characters on the pages belonged to the ancient civilizations of the late period. Although much knowledge had been passed down to future generations, it didn't mean it was seen in modern writing. Considering how meticulous the details of the beekeeping book were, Ash couldn't imagine anyone from the present having written it, which means it was made by someone from the past. In the best case, it was practically an archaeological evidence, a lost relic within the village. The protagonist comments on how amazing the book was and that it would take some time to absorb everything that was written, but as long as he had it with him, they would be able to start working with beekeeping. Then, Tanya falls silent, reflecting on this and lamenting her inability to read it as well. Oblivious to the woman's thoughts, Ash asks how her father obtained this book. After thinking for a bit, Tanya remembers it being a sort of family heirloom. Apparently, the ancestors had a habit of beekeeping, and it wasn't clear how they obtained that ancestral relic. However, it was known that these ancestors were well known outside the village for their talents. Since then, that book with the secrets to their famous beekeeping had been passed down through generations. At the same time, this was a tale passed down orally, so Tanya didn't know if it was entirely true, but Ash believes it is, as it was possible that these ancestors used the advanced technologies described in those pages to gain recognition. Moreover, this was an item of enormous value, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to classify it as a historical treasure. Tanya can't even believe that something like this is real, as the book was always randomly tossed around the house. Ash retorts that it is a worthy inheritance, and is sure that her ancestors must have kept it well to preserve the knowledge. He could only imagine how many years this silent sage had been asleep within those pages. It must have taken a long time since Tanya's family was able to read, and even with this problem, they never threw away that treasure. It was possible that they went through great troubles to protect the book. Still, they managed to fulfill that wish by keeping it intact for long decades. The descendants of the family may have lost the beekeeping techniques, but they could finally reunite with the talents of the past after so long. The protagonist could feel the determination coming from the written words, as well as the courage to oppose the tyranny of those who destroy history. With this in mind, the boy makes it quite clear to Tanya, and thus asks her to carry this legacy. In light of this, the woman feels pressured by being unable to read. The protagonist was willing to pass on the contents of the book if there was anything she didn't understand, so they could learn together. The only thing required from Tanya would be the willpower to learn her family's history and inherit their skills. After a moment, she agrees because this has always been her dream since she was very young. She admired her mother and father who were working all the time. Since those times, the girl began to follow in their footsteps day after day. But before she could learn, her parents left this world. Tanya was unable to understand anything that was left in the family book, so she thought she should give up this dream and do any other work within her reach. That's how she had been living for quite some time until now. However, it was always something she had desired and wanted to try. Just like her mother and father once did, Tanya wanted to follow the path left by both. In light of her determination, the protagonist agrees to help her as it would be a great pleasure. For now, they should start learning how to take care of the bees and what the secret technique left behind for centuries was. This was the official reception of the dreamer, and her family's battle against time was finally rewarded. A piece of knowledge that was on the verge of being lost forever was now in the right hands. With this in mind, Ash was excited because there was much work to be done from here on out. He intended to read the book as quickly as possible to learn beekeeping, and in the meantime, he should also manage to understand more of the ancient language. He could start by asking the priest to check the words described for assurance. That said, the protagonist asks Tanya if he could borrow her family treasure and keep it at the church for now, explaining about Folka being an archaeologist too. Upon hearing this, she agrees that it would be good to take great care of it. and Ash was quite determined to ensure that anyone who tried to touch the book would meet a miserable end. While discussing this, Jekyll observes from a distance and complains about seeing not only Micah getting close to the boy, but also his own older sister. Later, the protagonist decided to make his way to the church, quite happy that everything went well. Then, he asks his friend to pass a message to Yuika. It was necessary to tell her that they would probably start beekeeping and Tanya would be in charge of the work. Micah would like to learn to read even more alongside the protagonist, and he agrees, although he knows there are several complicated terms. On the way, however, Jekyll and his friends who used to tease Ash appear to get his attention. On the other hand, the boy apologizes as he had something important to do now at the church. Thus, he takes the opportunity to quicken his pace with his friend, but Jekyll calls him a coward for running. The three children start shouting childish insults, and Micah questions whether Ash intended to leave things this way as she was getting irritated. And the boy replies that it was all right, holding her hand and promising that they would hurry to stay away from the others. Seeing this scene infuriates Jekyll enough to throw a stone at the protagonist. Ash dodges just in time, now a bit more serious upon seeing that the other boy resorted to violence. Jekyll accuses him of feeling superior just because he had been the center of attention and was working on a remedy. Micah gets furious and yells at the boy that he has gone too far. Then the protagonist asks her to step back as it was dangerous. Finally, Ash approaches with serious intentions this time. After all, he intended to make him pay if he tried to damage that important book. So, he extends his hand towards the three violent children and makes a warning. The shot of that stone a little earlier was taken as a declaration of war, and thus he would use all the arsenal he had at his disposal to attack if necessary. This includes arrows, traps, and poison as well. If Jekyll throws another stone, he would make him pay for his actions. At that moment, the boy freezes as they stare at each other, clearly scared. After a silence that lasted a few seconds, Ash assumes that everything would be fine now and checks if Micah is not hurt. Finally, the two were able to leave and make their way to the church. Later, Micah happily told her mother about what happened and how the protagonist protected her. However, Yuika was worried because she heard that Jekyll was once again responsible for this mess. So she asked her daughter to listen carefully to what she was about to say now. In the future, there might be others who dislike Ash just like that boy, and it was possible that there could be many more people than that. As they knew, the protagonist was an impressive child who was able to learn to read and write and even invented a new type of medicine. This kind of thing was being done at an unusual pace even for adults, and the achievements he would have wouldn't stop here. Blessed people receive all kinds of attention, and not everyone in the world would support them. It was possible that they might try to attack him out of envy or steal the credit for his achievements. Who knows? Maybe even try to take his life. Micah feels sad to hear about this because she believed that everyone should just cheer for him. Since she was a child, she remembers that several other children and even older people commented on her family's improved conditions. Being the only daughter of the village chief, Micah understands how it was when people around her looked at her with discomfort and even some envy. In this, she agrees with her mother about understanding the situation. Yuka was embarrassed to have to say something like this now. But if one day her own daughter becomes strong and experienced enough to fend off those bothersome people, then she should do her best to help Ash. It would be necessary to gather people who would support him and make those who dislike him stay away. Protecting him and allowing Ash to pursue his dreams was something Micah would be capable of doing. The same boy who was so smart and always studied would eventually grow up to become a reliable person. He would become a star shining in the distance, and even Micah wonders if she would be able to protect someone like that. Yuka understands that it seems like a distant and difficult vision now, but she believes that her daughter is the right kind of person for Ash to have by his side. If he could protect him, then they could certainly be side by side in the future. Although Micah doesn't fully understand, she decides to agree, because it was her own mother who was saying this. The task entrusted to her seemed quite complicated, but the girl decides that she would strive to fulfill it. At the same time, she feels small next to the friend who was capable of doing great things and had the courage to face his own fears. If she should protect someone so incredible, Micah feels that she should improve on her own. And she decides that she would ask her father to teach her to fight using a sword so that she could strengthen herself. Yuka is startled and realizes that her daughter missed the point of the discussion, as she expected that strength itself would be psychological. But ignoring her mother's words, the girl remembers that she had to go to the church and would be carrying the wooden sword with her to protect Ash from now on. Yuika agrees that defending oneself is good, but asks her daughter to be careful and learn useful things in class as well. At the church, Foka comments that there were some lines that repeat frequently when deciphering the ancient language. Interfering with the meaning wouldn't work, but if they could make the writings create a sound with a sentence, there would be a risk of sounding very different from the original. Ash comments that it was possible for the same character to have several different meanings, or perhaps it could change tone and meaning depending on how it was used. The priest ends up agreeing that it is a possibility, which would explain why some phrases seem jumbled. But if that's the case, then they would have to focus even more on deciphering the translation. He thought that at least they were making a little progress, but at this rate, it seems they could barely reach the surface of the ancient language. Although folk looked in the beekeeping book, there were no interesting sessions that would help him decipher the writing of the ancestors. Speaking of which, the protagonist asks if he could take the treasure back now. Knowing that the boy intended to start working with bees, the priest agrees and returns the book. The original idea was for them to be ready to put the technique into practice next spring. These words surprise Folka, after all. It was quite early considering that the protagonist was talking about dealing with aloe just a few days before. Then, Ash explains that at this moment the balm was in Yuka's care and some other workers. While they continue talking, who appears in the cathedral as Micah accompanied by Tanya, the three would read the book together so they could also learn more about beekeeping. When the trio sits down to study, the protagonist checks the things that were being written. To start, Ash reads aloud about how the search for food causes bees to collect flowers. Immediately, the two girls are surprised because the boy is able to understand everything so quickly. When Micah apologizes and asks him to explain in simpler terms, the protagonist agrees to do so. To begin, he guides his friend to see the first sentence, and Ash would simplify it for them to understand. Even Tanya apologizes for needing to make the boy stop everything he was doing to teach her, but the protagonist saw no problem with that. After all, this book contains a large amount of valuable information, and there would still be things they could only learn by experiencing field work. Moreover, if Tanya could remember anything relevant about the process or the tools, it would be of great help. And so, the three spent their days deepening their knowledge about beekeeping. Since Tanya had started to see her parents working, she learned certain relevant information. Whenever the book described a particular technique, the woman would remember something her parents used to do when they were alive. The season for harvesting honey begins in spring, and since it was still autumn, they needed to start preparing. Thus, as soon as they managed to acquire the necessary tools and techniques for field use, the new season began. The group worked to make all the boxes where the bees would stay and looked for a good location to place them. They also confirmed the collection of wild bees and the method of extraction manually. Until one day, something caught Ash's attention. He understood that they should place the boxes in a location full of flowers so that honey production would be easier through pollen collection. However, there was no ideal location like this in the village. The first idea that came to mind was to prepare such a spot near the fields. This would be quite beneficial if the bees could pollinate them, and as a result, they could obtain more vegetables and native wild strawberries. Additionally, there was also the forest as another possibly suitable location, and Tanya herself agreed, remembering her father leaving the village with the boxes each season. Her mother never took her along because the forest was dangerous, even for those experienced in walking through it. If they were to opt for this option, then Ash believed they would end up having some problems. Since the boy spent some extra time with Ban in the forest to learn more, he discovered that the paths were always terrible, and he often risked his life. Remembering the hunter makes the protagonist consider that perhaps that man might know suitable locations for beekeeping. Tanya is curious to know why Ash is so close to Banny, and the boy explains that they ended up becoming master and disciple, but what also interests him is seeing the woman call the hunter by a cute nickname. She quickly stammers, embarrassed, and tries to say that it wasn't anything like it seemed. However, the two children understand exactly what was happening and agree that this situation was quite convenient, ignoring Tanya's protests. The woman tries to explain that they were old acquaintances and that Ban was someone who used to talk a lot with her parents. In particular, her father would often go to the forest and meet the hunter along the way. In this case, it was possible that Ban might know the location where beekeeping was done back then. It only made the children more determined to trust that man to help them. Micah decided she would tell her mother about it, so they could prepare a meeting with everyone soon. The group's meeting took place at the village chief's house. At first, Tanya was so nervous that she could barely lift her gaze, but it didn't take long for her to finally regain her determination. Thus, she raised her voice, saying that she appreciated everything Ban had done so far, and that was why she feared assuming that his kindness meant something more. However, it was Tanya's dream to continue the work left by her parents, and that was why she needed the hunter's help. The man immediately agreed to the request. After all, he remembered where her father placed the boxes, and there were several other locations in the forest that could be suitable for raising bees. He could only help when he was off work or on a break during a hunt. However, if Tanya didn't mind, then he was willing to do whatever he could to help. The woman is moved and thanks him, and the hunter replies that there is no need for that. as he just wanted to be useful. Finally, the rest of the group decided to leave to prepare dinner, leaving those two alone. In the kitchen, Yuika happily laughs upon seeing that the plan to bring them together worked. It seemed that Ban had cared for Tanya for quite some time, and it was nice to see that their relationship was heading in the right direction. Having resolved this situation, the path to starting beekeeping was looking better and better. Even Tanya went home all happy after spending some time with the hunter. Part of her hoped that her younger brother could understand what was happening. When she met Jekyll, she apologized for taking so long outside the house. But the boy understood and explained that he had eaten the rest of the food he had for dinner. Then, he asked how the group meeting went. Her sister explained that several things happened, but Ban decided to help them. And she happily told him how that man used to venture into the forest, which is why he would be a valuable ally. After hearing all this, Jekyll asked for permission and went to bed, ignoring Tanya's request to join them next time. In his mind, the boy was frustrated with himself and thought he could help his sister somehow. More time passed, and the trio studying at the church managed to create more productive sessions every time they were together. Ash mentioned that using hives to make candles was quite interesting, so people would have access to light every day. Even Micah could hardly wait because the honey they harvested the other day was delicious. Tanya was happy to see that the work she was doing yielded good results. If they continued like this, they would be able to gather enough to cook. The idea made the girl all anxious to eat better desserts than the previous ones. Then, they returned to reading the beekeeping book and focused on the interesting phrases. It stated that it was crucial to consider the flowering period of the plants that serve as nectar, and the pollen sources needed to be well cared for according to the ideal temperature. In this case, the protagonist believed they should move the boxes each season. As soon as Tanya said she remembered their father doing this, they decided they would ask Ban about it another time. Remembering this made Micah ask if Tanya had been having trouble walking through the forest recently, and the woman agreed that it had been complicated, but since she needed to learn to walk through the area for work, she had been training with Ban in her free time. Besides, Ash sometimes accompanied them and felt he was getting in the way of something between the two. Tanya was guided to walk along the safer path, but whenever she returned home, she felt exhausted. Apparently, the trail took a lot of energy and attention all the time. When Ash offered to answer any questions she had, the woman mentioned she was curious about something. Deep down, she felt bad for needing to ask him something like that, but she spoke anyway since it was about her younger brother. She knew that the protagonist might not want to hear about it, but there was no one else she could tell about this. Recently, Jekyll had stopped listening to what Tanya said, as if there was something on his mind, and whenever she asked about it, the boy would either run away or get irritated. Since the death of their parents, it was the older sister who took care of the younger one. Tanya believed she would be able to do the job of a mother, but filling the empty space left by their father was difficult. These were aspects she was unable to fill on her own. It didn't seem like Jekyll was able to get close to people his age, and his sister worried that it might have been her fault. In a way, it was possible that the boy had hidden his own problems and pains inside himself. In fact, Ash himself had trouble discussing emotional matters, but he wanted to help Tanya, who no longer had parents to confide in. Finally, the protagonist agreed to try talking to Jekyll to find out what was going on. Micah immediately became worried upon hearing this, and the boy calmed her down by assuring her that everything would be fine. Later, Ash found Jekyll curled up and deep in thought on a hill. Upon hearing that voice, the boy stood up agitated and on the defensive, questioning why he had shown up there. In response, the protagonist explained that he wasn't trying to seek revenge, but would like to talk a little. After staring at him for a long moment, Jekyll turned to leave because he had nothing to say to him. However, he stopped walking as soon as he heard that the subject of the discussion was his own sister. Ash explained that Tanya was quite worried about him to the point of thinking about it all day. Neglecting oneself in the forest could lead anyone to end up with serious injuries, and it was far too dangerous. It was obvious that Jekyll wouldn't want a disaster to happen to his sister. For her sake, Ash wanted to help her younger brother get rid of his own worries. Furious, Jekyll shouts for the other boy to shut up, as he was the last person he wanted to talk to right now. What irritated him the most was precisely the way Ash kept attracting everyone's attention all the time. This applied to both Micah and the adults around, and even his sister ended up going through the same. Jekyll pushes the protagonist, wanting him to stop acting like he was nice all the time when he didn't even know all the pain Tanya had gone through to survive. He hated Ash for always being so self-assured. Just because he learned to read and write and managed to create a medicine, it shouldn't make sense to receive compliments all the time. Gradually, Jekyll's anger turns into frustration and sadness for having seen his own sister come to depend on Ash. All this time, he had been trying to do his best for Tanya to help her. Since they were younger, it had always been just the two of them, and he was the one who knew her best. Still, for some reason, he had never been able to do anything for his sister. Knowing this makes him cry. angry and confused, as he wished he could be in Ash's place. After a moment of silence, the protagonist admits that he also wasn't capable of doing everything alone. In fact, he had always relied on everyone around him to achieve his own dreams. Besides, he was unable to ease Tanya's worries and came to see Jekyll because he knew he was the only one capable of doing that now. Ash didn't mind being hated, but he would at least like some support to help her. The two sit on the hill in silence for a good while before Jekyll comments on the death of his own parents. Because of that, the siblings had to work in the fields to survive. Even through hardships, they managed to get through them one day at a time, and Jekyll believed that if they were together, nothing would stop them. That was until another day when he found Tanya hugging a book and crying. It was then that the boy realized that his sister had always wanted to work with beekeeping. For a long time, Tanya had silently offered affection and made her younger brother not worry. However, he himself had never been able to do anything to compensate for her efforts, and yet he blindly believed they had been helping each other. Jekyll felt like a useless idiot because he knew nothing about beekeeping and was unable to read. The only thing he learned to do over the years was to take care of the fields, and thus, there was nothing he could do for his sister. Besides, recently, Tanya had become even closer to Ban than usual. At this rate, it was possible that they would get married. Ash asks if the idea saddens him, and Jekyll denies, as that wasn't the case. Until now, his sister had never shown interest in romantic matters, and the boy believed it was his fault. This was because Tanya had always prioritized Jekyll, and probably everyone who tried to get close had been pushed away. The boy liked Ban and knew he was a good man, even if he was the kind who was hard to talk to. The protagonist agrees with a laugh that the hunter was the introverted, unsociable type, but none of that mattered now. Deep down, Jekyll knew he could trust his sister to Ban and wanted to encourage their relationship. But the boy knew he would always be in the way of Tanya's decisions, and he hated that. His desire was to make her forget about that so she could be happy and focus on her own desires. This included not only marrying the one she loved but also doing her dream job. Jekyll even considered running away from home, but he had nowhere to go afterward and was desperate not knowing what to do. Surely it was this situation that worried Tanya, and now Ash understood all of this better. If that was the case, the protagonist suggests that the boy could find a suitable job and another place to live, giving space to his sister. In fact, it would be a good opportunity because there was a certain merchant looking for an apprentice. That was what he ended up hearing from the man in person. Hearing this made Jekyll practically beg Ash to introduce him to this man, willing to do any task that was asked, and the protagonist agrees to ask the merchant to visit the village when he is free. After reflecting for a moment, Jekyll sighs, commenting that there was no way to confront Ash. He apologizes for being such a jerk the other day by pushing him in the forest. It was frustrating to be unable to do anything while another person of the same age was good at everything they did. The boy felt lonely and lost to the point of seeing the protagonist as a threat and attacked him out of jealousy. Despite having done so many horrible things, Ash never retaliated in kind. So, after acknowledging everything he had done so far, Jekyll bowed, asking for forgiveness. This action made the boy smile, accepting the apology and assuring that he never took anything the other did personally. The two shook hands, and in the end, Jekyll thanked him for being so understanding. Days later, it didn't take long for him to discover that the merchant mentioned by Ash was none other than Ban. It was a huge shock when the hunter suddenly appeared asking to work for him. Setting aside this embarrassing situation, the protagonist suggested to Jekyll that they accompany them to the church as well. This way, he could spend more time with Tanya, and they would learn more about beekeeping together. When Jekyll became Ban's apprentice, he was able to learn hunting techniques and also supported his younger sister's work. It was a relief to see that everything ended up resolving, but something even more important happened after that. Jekyll had become quite observant and reliable in the forest, and being praised by Ash made him happy. Since then, the boy devoted his time to becoming a hunter, and when he was off, he studied reading and writing at the church. He also went to apologize to Micah about the stone incident earlier and acknowledged his own mistakes. In the end, the boy went to Ash's house to apologize to David and Sheila for what happened last time in the forest. In the meantime, Tanya had been making significant progress with beekeeping. Moreover, the bombs continued to be prepared under Yuika's management. The protagonist was regularly reselling the medicines and covered the expenses of his own experiments with papers, pens, and wood. As a result, the research at the cathedral also became more efficient. The most recent discovery was creating exemplary tests of candles and the balm that Tanya's mother used to make with the beehives. As several days passed, winter gradually approached, and this was the worst season of all for the village. As it got cold, more and more people collapsed, falling ill. Due to the constant lack of doctors and food, some residents had no way to receive proper treatment. Many lost their appetite with the fever and painfully ended up waiting for their own death. As soon as winter began, Ash knew he couldn't help but remember something that happened in the past. Back then, there was a boy named Tila who visited his house. The two used to go out to play in the fields and had fun. After they got tired, they would get hungry and couldn't do much besides endure the emptiness in their stomachs. Tiela was optimistic and made Ash feel cheerful because they could just pray to the monkey god for good harvests. Besides, David would surely have good results working hard this time. In the middle of his speech, the boy started to cough, probably because it was getting cold. Anyway, Tile decided to go home early to ensure he would be okay. The next time they saw each other, they would play again. Later, Sheila went to tell Ash something about the boy. At first, the protagonist thought his friend was better because the next day he didn't seem too well. Faced with her son's reaction, the woman hesitated before trying to say that Tile would be unable to play again. Apparently, it hadn't been long since he had died. Ash was in complete shock, and Sheila reminded him of when the boy had caught a cold. Since then, he never got better as winter worsened and his fever never went down. The mother didn't even know what to say to her son in this sad situation, but explained that things like this could happen more often in the future. Still in shock, Ash asked if colds shouldn't be easily cured, and she replied that wasn't the case because at least in this village, it wasn't possible. After Tile's burial, the protagonist had Tile's death on his mind for a long time. Several deaths occurred in the village due to simple injuries and illnesses. This made him wonder why life there was so poor and dangerous. At the same time, he wanted to understand why he was unable to save any of them. Suddenly, Sheila appeared to take her son out of the rain, worried that the boy might catch a cold. Although the woman tried to talk to him, Ash just apologized for not coming home in time, and she hugged him, responding that it was okay. After all, her son had always been very good, and things like that happen. These painful memories come to his mind and make the protagonist stop studying for a second. Things were different now. If the research he was conducting succeeded, then they would surely be able to handle the winter safely. The goal was to reduce the number of deaths, even if only slightly. And since then, Ash had studied analgesics and fever-reducing medications. To start, he prepared a broth made from a type of willow that was said to have been used to make medicines with anti-inflammatory effects. There wasn't much time until the change of season, so it was necessary to do everything possible and as quickly as possible. One day, as he progressed in his work, Ash ended up discovering something problematic. Drinking the willow broth has a rare chance of causing a serious reaction under certain circumstances. There was no mention of such symptoms in the botany guide, and none of the tests conducted remotely showed such effects. Since the protagonist was in a hurry to get the medication in time, he was careless to let this problem pass. Ash conducted extensive tests to check the actions of the groundhogs, and there were no issues when using it on himself. However, it would be best to avoid any dangerous situation to begin with. In the midst of his thoughts, suddenly Yuika bursts in, screaming desperately to tell that her daughter fainted from fever. Micah could barely stay conscious and did not respond when they tried to talk. Her fever was rising, and if they didn't do something soon, things would get ugly. The protagonist knew he had a medicine capable of lowering the fever, but he couldn't check the symptoms it might cause as a consequence. In this complicated situation, indecision was not the best option. It was necessary to hurry, or otherwise that lively girl would die. Ash was determined to save her, but that small chance of rare effects haunted him. As he remained unsure of what to do, the boy's mind made him remember Tile. This made him feel that he couldn't let such a tragedy repeat itself. If he had a medication in hand with great potential, he shouldn't hesitate. In this case, Ash rushed out of the house to go to the chief's house carrying the medication. He mentally prayed for Micah to be okay because he couldn't risk losing her. Meanwhile, the sick girl felt like she was agonizing. She was unable to breathe and felt hot and cold at the same time. Her body was getting heavier and heavier to the point of frightening her. As she felt herself sinking in this sea of pain and suffering, she suddenly heard a voice calling her name. Upon realizing it was Ash, Micah was surprised and wondered why he was there. A long conversation happened with her parents, but Micah was unable to figure out the subject. As she focused a little better, she heard Ash discussing whether he should use the medicine he had or not. Knowing that the protagonist had prepared a medication just for her moved her. As she leaned closer to hear better, Ash explained that it had the effect of reducing fever, but there was a rare chance of causing adverse symptoms. Micah felt that it must be a rather scary medicine, but deep down, she hated the feeling of suffering, as the pain was even worse than that. Suddenly, she heard Ash say that, upon discovering her friend's illness, he had made a decision immediately. He apologized for being unable to make a perfectly safe medication, but he wanted to ensure that Micah survived. Then the girl herself left the room stating that she would take the medicine. Yuika quickly stood up, worried because her daughter needed to rest, but the girl replied that she had heard everything and was fine with the idea of risking it to get the cure. Besides, it was her wish to get better soon and return to studying at the church with Ash. Faced with Micah's determination, Klein decided to respect her wishes. The father asked her to take the medication and get better quickly. Thus, the protagonist also asked to let him observe the progress of the fever so they could offer small doses from time to time. This would be the safest method now. Micah then told Ash that she would get better soon and smiled, which worried him. However, he needed to pray and have faith that everything would be okay. A few days later, the girl had been able to recover enough to sit without problems. Before, she had been so bad that she could barely walk on her own, but thanks to Ash's medications, everything was fine. It was a great relief, and the protagonist offered a mug of water for her to hydrate. It didn't take long for the girl to realize that the taste of the water was delicious. This was because it was mixed with salt and honey, which would bring several benefits to the body. After checking her condition, the protagonist made her lie down again to rest, but Micah was a bit disappointed to see him leave so quickly. Seeing this, he suggests they can talk a little more if it doesn't bother her. He decides to share about the progress in his research and mentions they have been making candles and more balms. The idea was to mix it with aloe vera and check if the effectiveness of the medicine improved. Moreover, some improvements were also made to the fever-reducing medicines. Ash discovered a safer medicinal herb that would replace willow bark. While discussing this topic, the boy starts to apologize for what he did earlier. He prepared an inadequate study and made her consume something that wasn't safe, which increased the risks more than usual. The girl quickly responds that there is no need to apologize. After all, she wouldn't have been able to heal if it weren't for Ash's efforts so far. In fact, she feels she should be thanking him. Changing the subject, Micah asks him to tell her more about what he has been doing in the tests. Ash mentions that the results have been slow, but it should be possible to finish everything by the end of winter. According to Yuika, they would start stockpiling the fever-reducing medicines and food at the village chief's house to distribute to everyone who is sick. The idea was to help alleviate the burdens of all the residents. Preparing all of this was a really difficult task. Still, it would be very kind of Yuika to take responsibility for managing this part as well, so they wouldn't have to wait for Quid's return. That's why Ash's current focus was on improving these cold medicines. It doesn't take long for him to realize he has been talking for too long, so he asks his friend to continue resting and not to overexert herself alone. Additionally, he would appreciate it if she could help test the bee ointment. Seeing her so eager to support him makes Ash smile and thank her, preferring that she focus on getting better first. As he leaves the house, the protagonist apologizes for having made such a long visit with Yuika. He managed to conduct several tests with the fever reducer and would like to deliver it as soon as possible. The woman thanks him because this winter they have been well prepared with medicines and food supplies. It was all thanks to the efforts of everyone there that many could be saved, and everyone in the mayor's house was grateful. They always had to prepare to witness the death of several residents in winter, but this time the woman feels that no one would be lost this year. The protagonist agrees as he is equally optimistic and intends to avoid that situation as much as possible. After finishing the conversation, the boy left, still reflecting on everything that had happened. Despite Yuika's compliments, Ash feels there is still a long way to go. There were no limits to what could be achieved in that village, and it wasn't just about medicine, but in many other areas. The prosperous life he desired was still quite distant. That said, the protagonist still intended to venture outside the village at some point. The idea was to go to the capital to get more books and perhaps discover more about this world. Upon arriving home, a voice soon shouted, calling his name. It was David, who was drunk and grumbling at his son for not taking his face out of the books instead of going out to help in the fields. For those born into farming families, working hard in the fields can make someone a good man. Working hard with a smile on one's face showed determination. This kind of attitude earns the respect of people and provides food for one's own family. That's how David thought, but his own son was different. The boy was always running and avoiding working in the fields, too busy with his books. Although he had said several times that reading wouldn't help with the harvest, Ash never gave up on being a scholar. Before he knew it, the boy was making plans with the village chief and creating medicines. The father knew that everything his son did was impressive, but studying was too difficult for a man like him. Sheila always smiled and said that their son was a great pride, and David agreed. Even so, part of him still believed that Ash should dedicate some time to the fields. David confessed this to his friends while drinking at the bar, and even his peers agreed that the protagonist was helping in the fields. They believed that David was worrying unnecessarily when he had an intelligent son. It was even hard to believe that boy was really his son. This irritates David to the point of shouting, and his friends laugh, explaining it was just a joke. On the other hand, Sheila had a lot of faith in her husband, and no one there intended to mock him for real. When he returned home, David was drunk and falling over the table, which worried his wife. She simply asked him to hurry and go to bed to rest. David was frustrated because their son hadn't come home yet, even though it was so late. As soon as the boy appeared, the first thing he did was complain about Ash for always being focused on reading and never helping in the fields. The two stared at each other in silence until the man told his son to sit down. David commented that a man's job was to take care of the fields, and Ash agreed that was usually the case, but learning information from books was important. It made him capable of managing various tasks and improving crop growth conditions. At that point, his father was saying things that didn't even make sense, and the son needed to translate the words. Ash said he was spending time trying to ensure the fields were well utilized so that everyone could have better results. Hearing him speak this way made the man grumble about how smart his son was. Deep down, David knew he wasn't a good husband or a suitable father. He had never done anything good for his family, but on the other hand, Ash was an incredible child. He was smarter than David would ever be, and had always been considerate of Sheila. The father knew he was being foolish for trying to reprimand the boy now. Remembering that they said they didn't even look alike made him hesitate a bit, and David himself asked Ash if he was even his son to begin with. There was a brief moment of silence, and the protagonist sighed. No matter where he looked, they were both part of the same family, and no matter how much that drunk father refused or felt downcast, none of that would change. Ash assured him it was true because he had only been able to grow up observing his father from afar, although David wasn't very admirable, complaining while drinking. Sighing, the man realized he had been a terrible example, even though his son had seen him all this time. Through tears, he acknowledged that Ash was a great son, and because of that, he wanted to become a better person. It didn't take long for David to fall asleep right there, and his son let out a sigh. Sheila appeared to thank Ash for listening to her husband's concerns. It was the man's way of expressing how much he cared for them. Besides, anyone who praised Ash always made David happy and proud. Despite saying this, Sheila asked him not to tell her husband that she shared this secret. Ash could only smile at his own family. And so time gradually passed until the arrival of spring. Every year, around this time they held an event called the Spring Festival. The goal was to lift the spirits of the village before starting to tend to the fields again. This year, the celebration was even more joyful than usual. The reason was that they had managed to endure and survive the winter without losing anyone. Ash was truly happy that everyone was alive and well. At that moment, David approached his son and commented on the weather. That was when the protagonist noticed that his father wasn't drinking as much as he usually did, and the man explained that he wasn't young anymore to wear himself out. It was time to start facing reality. Ash commented that he was proud to be the son of someone so wise, which made his father laugh. On the other hand, it was a good decision to take care of his own health. Although the boy wasn't strong, he was happy to have someone as reliable as David. These words only made the man prouder and prouder, laughing confidently because he wanted his son to see him as admirable. From now on, David wanted to become someone Ash could depend on for anything. Then, right away, the boy mentioned there was something he could use help with. Since Tanya was taking care of beekeeping, she said her fields were free now. Maybe they could use them together, and the protagonist wanted to do some tests there. The boy was willing to get his hands dirty with the extra work if needed, but David replied there was no need to think too much, as he could handle everything on his own. The two ended up reaching a very pleasant conclusion, and days later, with his father's support in the fields, Ash was able to conduct more experiments. Micah was healthy and showed up to accompany him this time. Helping him was the least the girl could do for her friend after everything. Previously, Ash had given up on the idea because there was a lack of space at home. But with Tanya's land, everything should be fine now. Moreover, he noticed that the bee balm was working because the girl's skin was soft and hydrated. They could probably start selling this ointment alongside aloe vera soon. Tanya's work was yielding good results, but it seemed she always had difficulty putting things into practice. Even after studying with her family's book, it wasn't an easy task to get used to. There were many things in the world that needed to be experienced personally to understand. Ash intended to visit her later, and Micah quickly wanted to accompany him. This worried him because he felt he was always dragging the girl back and forth with his experiments, but she responded that she was fine with it. Yuika told him how much the medications made by his friend helped the people in the village, and the protagonist replied that he felt he received too much credit. After all, he didn't do any of it alone. Deep down, everything he did was to achieve his own dreams, and it just happened to benefit the village people. His original motivations were selfish, and that's why he always felt he had to thank everyone who assisted him. After Ash and Micah thanked each other for always helping, the two agreed that there was still much to be done, until suddenly the sound of the emergency bell rang through the village. Several men appeared running, worried that someone had been attacked and not knowing what to do. The protagonist quickly asked what happened, and the adults shouted for them to flee because it wasn't safe there. There was a bear invading the village after destroying one of the entrance fences. This made the protagonist a bit tense. Bears were omnivorous creatures and usually ate plants and animals. Legends said that once they started to taste human flesh, they would be unable to feed on anything else. It would be terrible if any of the villagers became a target of those claws. The biggest problem was that Klein, the only swordsman in the village, was away on a trip to the capital. Ban and Jekyll were hunters who could help, but they were also in the forest and wouldn't return for a few days, which meant that the only one capable of dealing with that bear with tools and techniques at his disposal was Ash. With that in mind, he asked Micah to tell everyone to evacuate to the church. At that moment, the girl became worried to see that her friend intended to go out alone. Even though she insisted, Ash held her by the shoulders and asked her to listen carefully. It was the girl's job to relay his message to everyone in the church. After receiving this request, Micah was forced to accept. Then, the protagonist ran home. It seemed that his parents had already evacuated, so he needed to move quickly. To start, he grabbed 2 feathers, a bow, and arrows that should be useful, along with hunting tools. It was out of the question for the bear to approach the cathedral, so the best thing to do was to scare it away. Even scared, the boy ran toward where the animal was. As soon as he saw it, the protagonist assumed the bear had come out of hibernation, probably in search of food. When they faced each other, it was clear that the animal was hungry and ready to attack the boy. On the other hand, if he ran away, he risked making it come too close to the church. So, Ash stood still right there despite being a bit scared. The bear was the cautious type, checking the surrounding area to see if there were any other enemies. Thus, it stood on 2 legs and roared loudly. The protagonist felt tense, wondering if he would be able to defeat it. One way or another, he would have to do everything possible to protect the village. This place was his home after all. He used to hope to turn the village into one of dreams, and that dream was still far from being realized. If anyone wanted to destroy it, then Ash would stand in front to protect it and would become an enemy to anyone. As soon as the bear noticed the boy's battle stance, it charged at him. To start, the protagonist placed several spears on the ground. Then he would keep his distance to shoot arrows with the bow. However, the first shot didn't even penetrate the animal's thick fur. Soon after, the bear continued to approach at high speed. The movement of its arm caused the bow to break, and Ash fell to the ground. Although he lost the only way to attack, the boy knew there had to be another way to resolve the situation. Looking to the side, he noticed that one of the vials he carried had fallen and realized that using poison might be appropriate. He ran to grab one of the spears he had stuck in the ground. That liquid in the vial was a paralytic poison that Ban had given him as a gift. After dodging another attack from the bear, the boy brandished the spear at the creature and hit it. It should only be a matter of time until the effect took place, but before that, the animal managed to hit him squarely. Ash rolled away with an injury on his arm. Even though he was badly hurt, the poison was working. For now, he needed to use the time he had to stop the bleeding in his arm. He still had a few minutes until the paralysis took full effect, and the protagonist wondered if he could stay on his feet until then. Neither side had the right to stand still now. It was a matter of time for either of them to win or lose. Despite everything, the bear did not back down and charged at the protagonist immediately. Then, Ash threw the remaining piece of the broken bow in its face before running away. He grabbed the other spear he had stuck in the ground, knowing it wouldn't last long. But now that he had picked a fight with the animal, he couldn't back down. Inside, the boy was so scared that his own legs could freeze. Even so, the bear must have been equally terrified. It was running toward the spear without a second thought. This was a game of bets. The protagonist recognized how courageous that animal was. Having lived in the forest for so long, it was possible that the animal had gone through several dangerous situations. However, it was likely that it had never been this close to death on its own. This was the feeling that remained vivid within Ash's past memories. They were the final moments of a heartbeat, and the vision gradually darkening. There was also the sound of the wind and the slow stopping of organs, along with the consciousness slipping away. At this moment, the protagonist would use the fear of dying to stop the bear. As a result, the tip of the spear pointed at the animal made it stop. Hesitating, seizing the opportunity, the boy announced that the opponent had lost purely out of fear of death, and thus, he struck it squarely in the neck. But the bear had not given up and tried to bite the boy's head. By a hair's breadth, however, the creature fell to the side, causing Ash to sit down right next to it. Against all odds, he had won. The bigger question now was whether he could survive with such a bleeding arm. He needed to stop the wound, but he had no strength left. The situation was getting bad enough to make him feel his vision darkening. The protagonist did not want to die there, and fought with all his might to stay conscious. Meanwhile, in the church, Micah was worried that her friend had not returned yet. Ash's parents appeared to ask where their son was, who had not shown up, and the girl stammered about how he said he wanted to stop by home first. Then, a loud noise startled all the residents. They wondered what was happening and worried that the bear had approached the cathedral. At that moment, Micah ran to the door, concerned that her friend had not arrived yet. The situation was not good at all, and an adult wanted to go out to check. But before that, the girl ran ahead. She was the first to see both the bear and Ash lying on the ground, injured. Then, David and Sheila were shocked by the scene, quickly rushing to help their son. They noticed how badly the boy was hurt and were left bewildered as to how something like this happened. Sheila asked Yuika what to do, and the woman nervously stammered that they needed to stop the bleeding, but everyone was anxious because the boy had closed the wound by himself, yet the blood wouldn't stop flowing. Micah remained frozen in place, panicking and wondering how this could have happened. They had been together just a little while ago talking, and everything was fine. There was no way her friend could die in a situation like this. The voices of the adults continued to spread, asking if the bear was dead and how Ash had done this. They were worried that they would be unable to help the boy, and that perhaps the injured arm would no longer be usable. At this rate, it would be the end for him. Hearing all this made Micah wonder what she should do. She didn't want her friend to die, as she would never be able to talk or study by his side again. On the other hand, it wasn't like she knew anything about treatments, and so she felt useless until she remembered something Ash had told her in case she got hurt in the future. The first thing to do was to move the patient from outside to inside the house and apply first aid. It was necessary to make as many clean cloths as possible and also bandages. Using well water wouldn't help treat the wound. It needed to be boiled first. If there was a lot of bleeding involved, then she should use pieces of clothing or thread to minimize the damage. Micah realized that what she needed to do was memorize everything she had learned from her friend. When she had a fever and was sick, it was he who helped her. Now, it was time for her to go rescue the boy. With that in mind, she tells the adults that they should first perform first aid on Ash. Yuika was startled by her daughter's proactivity, but they continued to listen to her request to take the boy inside the mayor's house. They would need hot water, so everyone living nearby should hurry to help. Additionally, Folke and Tanya appear to assist after having learned medical treatments. If there were more people capable of helping, then Yuika asked them to lend a hand to her daughter. She asked Micah to go help Ash, while the mother would explain the confusing situation to those who were puzzled. Upon realizing she was receiving so much support, the girl was moved but asked everyone to follow her to her own house. She was determined to do whatever it took to save Ash. A good amount of time passes, and care continues to be given to the boy. For now, they manage to clean the blood and close the large wound on his arm. The priest observes that his fever was decreasing, and all indications were that his health conditions were improving. Sheila thanks him and Tanya for having done so much so far, and they withdraw to go home and rest a bit. Finally, Micah asked for permission to enter the room after bringing some clean towels and new bandages. Ash's mother comments that there was no need for the girl to overexert herself since she could rest if she was tired. However, she refuses to do so while her friend was still bedridden. This determination makes Sheila smile, starting to recount the birth of her son. It had begun on a snowy, cold night. David was the one who placed the baby in the mother's arms, and Sheila comments on how Ash was born on a day that was freezing. The sun was setting quickly, and it was difficult to bathe a baby in the dark. At least it was a relief that they had managed to get some candles from the village chief. Surely the couple should thank him at the next opportunity. Despite all the unfavorable conditions, Ash fell asleep quickly. David soon mentions that they needed to name him, and his wife agrees. It was the least they, as parents, could do by bringing him into this world. The two discuss the possibilities, as they would like their son to grow up healthy and receive good fortune in life. Having been a child born on a cold night, perhaps it was fitting to give him a name that would never make him feel the lack of warmth and light. In this case, the sun or the stars might be suitable, but summer, candles, and fire were also good examples. It doesn't take long for Sheila to notice that dawn was beginning to break, and her husband decides to get up to make breakfast. People from the village had brought some soup as a gift for the birth and said to deliver it to Sheila as soon as she was better. It was good that at least they had left the charcoal burning since the night before. At that moment, his wife observes the flames and thinks about the ashes left behind. Immediately, she suggests the name Ash for their son. At first, David felt it was a rather plain name, and the woman agrees that it is the case, but she feels that something like this could provide him protection in life. That boy didn't have to be necessarily blessed like those born in spring or summer. They lived in the middle of nowhere, and there were times when they had problems to the point of going through hardships and suffering. On the other hand, ashes can survive long cold nights and keep the fire going until the next day, and that can certainly be considered luck. The name Ash, full of hope, that protects the flames until the end. The way his wife says it makes David consider it better. After all, one couldn't make fire without ashes. In the end, the two decided to accept naming him this way. Since that night, Sheila had been praying for the boy to grow up healthy. For some reason, she ended up remembering this just now and wonders why. At the same time, she thanks Micah for having listened to this story. The The girl mentions that she heard a story about Ash from the priest before. It was when he had gotten lost in the forest and there were no signs of returning. At that time, she was quite worried, but Foka took the opportunity to tell a legend from long ago. It was about the legend of an immortal bird god who could not die. It didn't matter if it was hurt or aged. There would be cinnamon branches ready to reignite its flames and make it burn once more. Soon after its magic burned to the end, the bird could emerge again from the ashes. By doing so, it would return with more strength than before. That was the extent of the power carried by Ash. That was why Micah always wanted to believe that her friend would be okay and learned this from the priest. As long as they could take care of his wounds and treat him, surely the boy would be able to recover. Moreover, Ash himself had taught her various relevant information about medicine. Since then, she read books and checked what she learned from all the other adults, helping with the boy's treatment. Still, it had been days since the bear attack and Ash had not woken up. Micah was worried that perhaps the way she treated him was wrong and feared what might happen from then on. Even though she wanted to save him, her heart was filled with regrets and doubts. She believed that if she hadn't run away earlier, perhaps avoiding letting Ash go alone, then none of this would have happened. The girl lamented and believed it was all her fault and broke down in tears. While she was so sad, Sheila approached and hugged her to console her, saying it was okay and that it wasn't her fault. After all, Micah was the one who worked the hardest to help her friend get better. Still, she was afraid that perhaps Ash would remain unconscious forever. There was so much she wanted to do and say to him, but she hadn't even had the chance. That was why she didn't want to see him die. In the midst of those tears, Ash slowly opened his eyes and began to apologize very slowly. At that moment, both of them stood up shocked to see him wake up. Sheila was the first to run to call her husband and tell him what happened. Meanwhile, Micah said she was very scared after he hadn't woken up for so many days and was afraid they wouldn't be able to talk anymore. And Ash smiled, kindly responding that now they could do that, so there was no need to keep crying. After the protagonist's awakening, he received strict orders to never leave the village chief's room without notifying anyone. Seeing how busy everyone was with the seasonal work, the boy worried about the progress of his own projects, but all the village allies were willing to put in the effort and thus tried to ensure that Ash continued to rest. The priest also visited him, sighing at the thought that the protagonist would start tinkering with bizarre projects again as soon as they avoided looking at him. This made Ash complain about being treated like a troublesome child, and Folka laughed, because it was indeed the case. Anyway, they discussed the new topic of interest for the boy that he had been having difficulties dealing with recently. At that moment, the priest reminded Ash that he had a loan to pay and should recover at once, so they could discuss important things later. Although the boy tried to explain that there were other tasks to do, Folka didn't care. As his rest progressed, Ash took the opportunity to read the books he had wanted so much. Although he hadn't planned it, he ended up needing to recover at the village chief's house for some time. He expressed gratitude and apologized to Yuika for the inconvenience. But instead, the woman was grateful that the boy had protected the village. The woman became so focused on taking care of him that she practically made him feel indebted. That was how the protagonist took advantage of the reading and resting season in bed. But to take the next step in life in the village, he had read all the church's practical guides and concluded that it would be difficult to progress further. All the agriculture books mentioned the creation of fertilizer, but there were certain techniques that could only be done in other locations, besides the problems related to vocabulary still unknown to Ash, as well as ingredients and methods of action that could not be understood just with those guides. Because of this, Folka was asked to contact the capital's temple to borrow more books about chemistry, but it would be difficult to have enough time for that now. From what it seems, ancient civilizations had knowledge of germs and viruses, but such information was not passed down to modern times. To make matters worse, there was a lack of proper equipment for both chemical experiments and temperature molding. Making a single bag of fertilizer would not be easy, but the goal had always been to increase food production. Recently, Ash felt he had reached the limit of what he could do there in the village. It was necessary to start thinking about obtaining materials and ingredients from far away. In the midst of his reflections, Yuika appeared to check on how the boy was doing, and Ash told her he was feeling much better after receiving the treatments. In that, the woman mentioned that this coming winter she would like to send her daughter to her grandparents' house in the capital to study. Micah was proficient enough in reading, writing, and arithmetic too. The point that it seemed she would be fine taking care of herself outside the home, but not everything was about studies. It was also about making connections and relating outside of the comfort zone. That girl was quite clever, and it was all thanks to Ash, who was such a good friend and mentor. Even though they had said the same thing several times, the girl's parents could never show how grateful they truly were. The protagonist feels honored to receive so many compliments and is happy to see that he could help his friend. It was nice to receive such words from someone he respected. Although everything started with selfish desires, somehow the boy earned the appreciation of others. Seeing that Yuika wanted Ash to accept more gratitude from others, he chuckled a bit at how observant she was. At this point, the boy wouldn't be able to just do anything without worrying about the burden he would place on those around him. It was never his intention to hurt others with his decisions, but there were times when emotional outbursts happened, and Ash didn't know how to handle them. The boy assumes that Yuika noticed this problem in him and tried to talk to him to make him reflect on it, and there was no way to disagree with that observation. Deep down, he ended up being moved by the way the woman spoke. If it made others notice this in him, it meant that his emotional slips were worse than he imagined. Returning to the main topic, Yuika mentions having an offer regarding Micah. In fact, the proposal was to have Ash go to the city as well, and he immediately agreed. The reason for his excitement was the chance to go to the capital's temple and find new books, besides all the ingredients and various other materials that could be found with the local merchants. His greatest interest was related to the technologies and knowledge that would take his research even further. Yuika sighs upon seeing him back with the energy he had before. At first, she intended to use various means to convince him to accompany Micah, but she never imagined the boy would be so excited. Although the capital wasn't as grand as the royal capital, at least it would be enough to satisfy Ash's interests. Realizing he was practically shouting in excitement, the boy apologizes. Even so, he was curious to know when they would travel and remembers it would be during the next winter. Before that, it would be necessary to discuss it with the protagonist's parents so they could transfer the boy's tasks to others. There were several preparations that needed to be made considering Ash wouldn't be returning to the village anytime soon. Finally, the protagonist agrees and realizes why Yuika was so serious about the trip. It meant he would need to distance himself from everyone there, stopping the research he had been doing until now, and he wouldn't be able to see all the villagers for a while. It was at that moment that Yuika saw the boy was reflecting better on it. It was difficult to do new things while staying in the village, and the capital would offer more chances to study certain subjects in depth. It would certainly be a big step to help in the influential life of the village, and in this case, Ash felt he should move forward. Thus, he openly states that he would travel and asks to be allowed to accompany Micah. He would just need to prepare as the woman said, and he would also have to hurry and inform others about his absence. There was also the need to write improved instructions for when the boy was away, so that allies would know what to do in certain situations. Ash was truly motivated to help others learn to read, and also to gather more results from his own research. This meant his schedule would be quite packed moving forward. That made Yuika laugh. After all, the boy was always optimistic and made her feel silly for worrying so much. Later, the protagonist told the priest about his intention to go to the local capital that winter. It was a place he had always wanted to visit since he would have the opportunity to study under the recommendation of the family head. Folk knows this means he would be away for quite some time, about 2 years in total. However, Ash would like to visit the village a few times in the meantime. One way or another, the boy's repertoire only tends to grow, and it wouldn't be long before the injuries caused by the bear healed completely this time. The excitement makes the priest chuckle a bit. It was for something like this that all the adults were constantly worrying about him. In that, the protagonist comments on how he was Folk's #1 disciple, and maybe he could care a little more too. At that moment, the priest bursts out laughing because the boy was not the type to fall and not get back up. Twice Ash almost died, but it wasn't as if that was enough to make Folka doubt him. He was sure of this, because the boy said some things while he was feverish, repeating over and over that he wouldn't die, and assuring that he would survive, no matter what. Remembering all of this still makes Folka laugh out loud, as Ash's determination would make even a god of death think twice before doing his own job. The boy blushes in embarrassment for knowing he was exposed like this, but it was true that he was desperate to keep living considering there was so much he wanted to do. The priest smiles in agreement, happy to see him motivated, especially considering that the boy had made the early decision to go to the capital. There was no turning back now, and for the time being, Ash promises he would write back if the priest sends letters. It seemed like a good way to kill time while he was buried in work. Finally, Folka stands up and ruffles Ash's hair, suggesting he do his best while still in the capital. The man leaves the room, which confuses the protagonist, but apparently, he just intended to take a little walk. This decision was sudden and strange, considering the priest usually stayed locked in his own room all the time. But Folka just waves back, mentioning that next time they can continue the decoding research. This makes Ash smile a little too, wishing the priest could also keep striving for his own dream. Since the plans for the trip were finalized, the protagonist began working day after day to prepare everything for the successors of his research. Before he knew it, the seasons continued to pass, and winter arrived. It was the day of Ash's departure and the last time he would be in the village for a long time. Therefore, he decided to visit the cemetery and say goodbye with a prayer for the deceased. Every time the number of graves increased, his heart filled a little more with despair. Several deaths from simple occasions happened in the village, and the memories of what he went through with Tiele still haunted him. The slightest mistake could have had him buried alongside all the others. Given this, the thought that kept him standing was the fact that surviving made him rise from the ashes anew, and then he would plant new seeds for the future. This world was poor and dangerous, and he should never forget that it was for this reason that he needed to do something about it. Instead of clinging to despair, he had to use that one spark of determination inside his chest. It was the third winter since he had started the journey to learn the written language and read books. This year, he would be turning 11, and in honor of the deceased, he would be leaving the village to do his best. He was tired of always being in the ashes. It was time to find a new city and make the dreams he had see the light. Thus, Ash and Micah used Quid's borrowed carriage to make the trip. The local capital was at least exciting, and the protagonist's friend was happy to have him around, as she used to get quite anxious thinking she would have to study alone. In response, the boy promises he would support her, and states that going to a new place would be good. At first, it seemed to Ash that they had left the village a few hours ago and thought it would take a long time to arrive, but the merchant soon tells them they were quite close and points to the view of the city in the distance. Squinting, the protagonist could see stone walls that served the purpose of a fortress. They were broken in some areas, and perhaps it was because they had faced a battle but never managed to repair it. There was a ballista too, but it didn't seem like there were cannons or firearms there. Essentially, that location needed to be well defended, and they were entirely using manual firepower for that. In any case, Ash didn't think he could understand the details unless he saw them with his own eyes. They would venture forward and enjoy everything the new city had to offer. Upon arrival, the two children were amazed by the beauty of the place and the number of people. However, Ash noticed that the houses there were made of wood, and there seemed to be no sign of any made with stones or bricks. He was expecting the capital to be more about development and technology, but that wasn't the case. Things were not in the protagonist's favor now, but his experience living in the village was enough not to make him hesitate to be in a less developed place. For now, it would be enough to occupy himself with the tasks he had to do, using all the willpower he had always had. Quid suggests that they should first greet the lord of the city, and points to the mansion they need to go to. On the way, Ash had the chance to see some buildings, and as he expected, there were indeed those made of stone. The fact that there was a completely destroyed fortress means that there might be a lack of materials for reconstruction. There should be a reason for this even though there are nearby cities that could help. Micah shrinks back, agreeing with her friend's words. Ash is curious about her reserved behavior and asks if she is okay, and she explains that she is worried about not greeting the lord of the city properly. The boy knew they would see Yuika's brother, who would be Micah's uncle and would certainly be a kind person. In this case, everything would be fine as long as they are polite and do their best. Quid is happy to see that the two children were full of goals on their own. On the other hand, the merchant was not nervous at all because he was used to it. That city was the main one where he usually sold aloe balm, and Ash remembers that Yuika used to send the product to her parents in the capital. While they waited in the chief's house, a maid appeared to announce that Lord Itsuki Amanobe Sakula was there. Then, Yuika's brother appeared apologizing for the delay and explains that it was because the original chief of the city went to the royal capital and has not returned yet. The royal capital of the Sodra kingdom was quite far from there, and Itsuki governed the area in his father's absence, who was the original lord of the city. The protagonist realizes that Yuika was actually born into a family of marquises, being from the upper class. Then, Micah approaches to greet her uncle and speaks in the most polite way possible. She explains that she came there to do Klein's annual reports and hands the paper to the lord to take a look at later. After a moment, Itsuki starts to laugh and decides to set aside the formalities. Instead, he preferred to act as he normally would, rather than force himself into that serious facade. The man was very happy to see his niece after such a long time. The last time he saw her was when she was just born, and she probably wouldn't remember him. Itsuki was amazed at how much Micah had grown and how she had become a beautiful woman, like her mother. After receiving such a polite greeting, it was clear that Klein's work in teaching her had been very good, and his serious nature had not disappeared. He is curious to know if his sister and brother-in-law were well as usual, and the girl agrees, which relieves him to see that the model couple of Sakura was still going strong. Ash wonders if Yuika and Klein had such a reputation. In any case, Itsuki was eager to allow his niece to start studying and would like to see her growth with his own eyes. Then, she thanks him in such an adorable way that almost makes the man faint. Setting aside how much of a doting uncle he was, Itsuki apologizes for having ignored the other two in the room. Although he recognized the merchant's face, Ash was a new face he had never seen before. Immediately, the protagonist introduces himself quite politely, and this makes the Lord understand why his sister and brother-in-law spoke so highly of him, and despite being a somewhat rude comment, it didn't seem like the boy was the son of farmers. It kind of made Itsuki eager to see him in the Junior Military Association, and he mentions that his younger brother named Arthur would be participating as well. For now, there was no need to cling too much to formal titles, and the man would like all the children to treat each other as friends. The Junior Association brought together all the young people connected to influential people in the city, thus allowing them to make connections and also enjoy their youth. Ash assumes that the more one becomes a public figure, the more valuable the trust bonds made in private life would be. If that were the case, then it would be a great fortune for the protagonist to be merely a farmer, because he had no standing from the village he came from. He would have the freedom to meet Arthur, and they could get closer without focusing on connections of great importance. Again, Itsuki is amazed at how admirable that boy's spirit was. Until the maid catches the Lord's attention because it was time for him to return to his duties, and she needs to discuss to make him stop wasting time. Finally, Itsuki apologizes but had to excuse himself for now. He appreciates the effort Quid made in bringing the children there, and says that Micah's and Ash's rooms were ready to be used. The Lord hopes that the guests can enjoy their time in the city and could talk again when things calm down. As the Lord left, another maid took the opportunity to help Ash and Micah reach the dormitory where they would spend their days. This place was previously the administrative hall, which changed for political reasons. In short, there was space for the marquis to sleep, and next to it, the place where the students stay. The rooms were separated on the first floor for boys and the second for girls. It didn't take long for the protagonist to say goodbye to his friend and head to his own room. Since students usually slept in pairs, it meant he would have a roommate. Upon arriving at the room, Ash greets his colleague and introduces himself. Arthur, who was waiting for him, welcomes him quite politely. Although Itsuki had said he was his younger brother, all the protagonist could think was that this boy looked more like a girl. The truth was that the person who became Arthur had arrived there a month ago, but before that felt confused about needing to play such a role. In the capital, those who knew her due to her birth circumstances always wanted to take advantage of her status, and there were those who found the girl's existence problematic. The whole family was hostile regardless of what she did. So the girl stopped expressing dreams or desires and confined herself to her room. Despite everything, the conflicts around her continued to grow, and she was eventually expelled from the royal capital while hiding her identity. As a result, she had to hide her origins, gender, and name. The girl became the son of Count Secula, named Arthur, with a new story and goals. In short, this was just a persona created to protect her from the dark schemes of royalty. It was necessary to endure this treatment for her own safety, so she wouldn't cause problems for others or for those supporting her. She believed everything would be fine, as she could endure using her own strength and was used to always being alone. From now on, she just had to control her emotions and keep a smile on her face. From this point on, she would live and behave solely as Arthur. Ash greeted him as soon as he saw him in the room, although he was having an internal dilemma. That was the boys' dormitory, and yet he was sharing a room with someone who was a girl. It was clear that Arthur was born into an influential household, but unlike Itsuki and Yuika, who were blood siblings, that boy had no similarities with them. It was possible he was a child born of the Count with a second wife in the royal capital, but it couldn't be that simple. In other words, the protagonist knew that Arthur must be a very strong person to try to keep the disguise a complete secret. For whatever reason, the best thing to do was to not get involved. But now that he noticed at first glance, he couldn't risk pretending, and considering they had become roommates, trust had to be built gradually. Eventually, Arthur would realize that the protagonist noticed the truth, and then Ash would have to be careful not to hurt his feelings. The best scenario would be to make her believe he had been quiet all along because he was concerned about hurting her. Realizing there was someone his age going through an even more intense situation made him take a deep breath. He believed everything would be fine. After all, even if he knew her secret, the boy was just an ordinary person from the countryside who wanted to make friends. Who knows, there might be a chance for Arthur to support him in his dream of creating new technologies and improving his own research. After all this reflection, the protagonist comments about Micah, who accompanied him to the city. Ash asks if he wouldn't like to talk to her. After all, it seemed like a good idea to get to know her since they were part of the same family. After a moment of hesitation, Arthur agrees and asks to be introduced to her later. As soon as he notices his expression, the protagonist suggests they become friends. The idea makes Arthur a bit tense, but he smiles happily at the thought. In any case, Ash suggests they go out soon since he promised Micah they would meet at the entrance after they stored their luggage. Meanwhile, Micah was happily descending the stairs. Her meeting with her uncle went off without incident, and she felt quite relieved. From now on, she would have a new life in that student dormitory. Knowing she would be living in the same building as Ash made her very happy. Once they were together, the distance between them would decrease, and who knows, the boy might notice her more. Micah would always be welcoming his future feelings with open arms, no matter what was done. This reminds her that her own mother had noticed how much her daughter liked Ash. So, the girl took the opportunity to tell everything about it and details about how they felt when they were talking. Yuika says she has always been by Micah's side until now, but in the real capital, her daughter would have to fend for herself. In the city, the protagonist could end up being captivated by other interests, and there would certainly be even more people who would support him. Thus, Micah would have to strive and do her best like never before. The day Ash becomes captivated by her may never come, no matter how much time passes. Returning to the present, Micah was ready to make her plans work, and knew she couldn't just daydream. Even if she was alone, she had to do her best to help her friend. A little later, she walks to the entrance hall to meet Ash. Just when she waved from a distance and saw him, Micah noticed he was accompanied by someone who must be Arthur. Her cousin seemed more mature and stylish, giving an impression worthy of someone from the big city. It must be nice to be Ash's roommate, and even Micah wanted to be in his place right now. But the closer Arthur got, the more the girl's impression changed. Immediately, she couldn't understand how a boy could be so handsome. For some reason, Micah's chest began to hurt immediately. Ash approached and apologized for keeping her waiting, and the girl stammered that it was okay. The protagonist introduced his roommate Arthur, who greeted her politely. Micah noticed that her friend was acting normally, so her cousin must really be a guy. As she thought, women couldn't sleep in the male dormitory. She felt silly for overthinking and tried to calm down. Things would work out as long as she spent more time talking to Arthur in the future to find out if he was a good person. The next day, the trio of kids would finally start classes at the academy. They were wearing uniforms too and would study at the temple, so Arthur was responsible for showing the way and explaining the routine. Micah asked what kind of things they would do during the lessons, and her cousin realized he would have to share the details. The purpose of the academy was to train the next generation to become the future leaders of cities and villages. There were two different types of curriculum, one being the military course, and the other, the general course. It was possible for fundamental studies to continue in all years, and this time they would be practicing reading and writing. Ash wondered if the upper-class kids only learned this at this point, as he was kind of expecting to study something different. Then, the boy explained that he and Micah were already good at it, which surprised Arthur. The two had read all the books from the village cathedral. In that, Arthur mentioned it was rare to have churches functioning in rural villages, which meant their priest must be an incredible person. At that moment, Ash denied it because clearly, Folk was someone without any hope. His reaction made Arthur smile, not quite understanding why he said something like that. Finally, the protagonist tried to explain that the priest was a lazy scholar. Even though he was a good person, he still had inappropriate speech, conduct, and an unhealthy lifestyle. This description made Arthur almost cry from laughing, but they finally returned to the main topic of conversation. There was no need to worry about the other students since they were all good at reading and writing too. Micah commented that it was a relief, and Ash agreed. One of the main reasons he went to the city was to visit the temple library. As time passed, he would be able to make the fertilizer so that his research wouldn't come to an end so soon. No matter what was done in the future, the most important thing was to increase food production. Arthur didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but he understood that the protagonist would study something like that considering he came from a farming family. In that, Ash shared his dream of creating an abundant and convenient life, exactly the kind one could find in history books. This would change everything not only for the villagers, but also for others in nearby places. He wanted to do everything possible so that everyone could live well, with good clothes, houses, medicine, food, and much more, all to make life more comfortable and fulfilling. After a moment, the protagonist apologized for getting carried away with his words and talking too much. Arthur silently reflected on this dream of his with a sad face. Then, he asked Ash if it would be okay to help him with this dream. Immediately, the protagonist agreed, happy to have more people who could walk this path for him. Micah explains to the confused Arthur that this was the friend's internal, animated spirit and he shouldn't be scared by the quick change in behavior. In any case, the intense protagonist was practically shouting with excitement for them to hurry to the temple. Seeing those two joyfully rushing, Arthur could only smile as he followed them. In the 5th province, there was the branch temple, and soon the protagonist comments that the place was so large it couldn't even be compared to the village church. There were several cleric members gathered there as well. Instead of studying literature, they spent their time reading for recreation and should start by talking to the people of the cathedral. Soon, a person approaches calling out the names of Ash and Micah. It was a priestess who introduces herself as Yae, one of the instructors of the academy. Immediately, the protagonist greets her too, and explains that he made some requests through Folka to obtain books. Yae thinks about it for a moment before realizing something. She exclaims in surprise upon realizing that this was the boy she had heard so much about, and can't believe someone like him requested such difficult-to-read books. The shock was so great that it left her a bit dizzy, and Micah asks her friend not to approach as it would only worsen the situation. When Ash looks confused, the girl explains that his presence can overwhelm others, so they should find people and talk calmly. Yae herself apologizes for her reaction, as the boy in front of her was younger than she expected. The books that were requested were so complex that only church members could read them. Knowing he was a prodigy helping to decipher ancient texts, the priestess believes there is no need for literature classes now. She suggests that the two newcomers proceed to read what they wish and hopes their journey there is very fruitful. Arthur soon asks what this matter of deciphering ancient writings was about, and Ash tells him about the civilizations of the past. At that moment, the boy makes a face and understands better what Micah meant about him being a presence that overwhelms others' minds. Ash knows he was only able to get this far because he had memories from his previous life. Otherwise, he would be a perfectly ordinary child. In this, Micah agrees that although her friend is intense, he is quite fun to be around. Arthur enjoys himself, as he never thought he would meet someone like this before. Finally, Yae decides to guide them to the library, and the children are amazed when they see the enormous amount of books there. There were 20 times more compared to what was in the village. It was like an entirely new world. On the other hand, compared to the heart of the territory, this room would only be considered the reading room. The books were too valuable, and therefore few could access them. Ash remembers that in his previous life, libraries were public, and the vast knowledge of various areas was always disseminated. Right now, it was necessary to investigate about fertilizers as soon as possible. Since natural and chemical sciences could not be easily understood, the protagonist decides to check if there were popular subjects related to ancient civilizations. The priestess believes that such articles are not stored outside the temple of the royal capital. In each city and village, there was a church, and the books were kept inside according to the teachings of each location. Books with information from ancestors were kept more secret from others. And Ash agrees because in his village there were also only contents related to field applications, but they were not all complete. It has been generations since the temple stabilized the doctrine of utilitarian books, and in the meantime, much information and understanding necessary to read the books has been lost. It was too tragic because the books lost their target audience and could not be effectively used now. Although everything has been preserved on pages, at this rate, the loss of knowledge and techniques only tended to increase. In the future, perhaps the temples can adjust the teachings and distribute books to others. Ash's suggestion made Yae curious. At the same time, she reflects that some within the church have already questioned the usefulness of changes and new technologies considering they were A. It was true that there were those who questioned the usefulness of children studying there, considering that the temple had a well-established organization. On the other hand, this group also had its own traditions, and each present priest was a product of humanity's goods passed down through generations. It was not all based merely on presumption, but rather a legacy carried with responsibility that must be valued. Ash expresses to Yae his appreciation for providing such a wonderful perspective on her own religion. Having been born in a remote village, he would love to learn more about the view the people of the church had regarding the world. In this case, the protagonist decides to support what the cleric wanted to do, and in the meantime would make good use of the books available to the public. To start, they should divide the tasks and appreciate those that were already laid out on the table. Since the goal was to study the creation of fertilizers, they would focus on the chapters regarding soil and planting methods. The protagonist was quite grateful to Yae for taking the time to help them with this. Moreover, he would leave it to Arthur to briefly summarize the contents for later, but the more the boy read, the more he made a face as if he understood nothing. The written vocabulary was deeply complex, and there were no words he understood, and Ash believed it was normal since it was an agriculture book, especially for someone who had never lived in a village. Thus, the protagonist decided he would help his friend consume the content from the beginning and could explain the basics. Arthur apologized, but Ash saw no reason to feel bad since he was being helped with so many people willing to read by his side. For him, it would be something good to teach him a new subject so they could have fun together. The first description was about plowing a field. Solidity, height, and uniformity were all important to check how much it would vary with the type of seed planted. There were also other outdated words for vegetables, and the protagonist explained everything that seemed difficult. While Ash found parts that were interesting, Arthur got distracted by his face. Suddenly, Micah waved because she found similar descriptions and let her friend read in her place. The characteristics for an organic fertilizer and types of compost had various ingredients and ways to use them, but there was nothing written about how to create them, so they would have to look in other sources. Just a moment later, Arthur read aloud about this same topic in the book he had in hand. Although he didn't know the details, it seemed they had found what they were looking for. Ash noticed that the step-by-step said to use chicken manure. If that were the case, then perhaps they wouldn't find only relevant information in agriculture books, but also in those related to livestock. Ash and Micah agreed excitedly, praising Arthur for being so clever. Although the boy felt nervous for not thinking it was anything special, the protagonist didn't see it that way. It was a valuable observation since they could expand the number of contents to investigate. That was the main reason it was so important to gain more allies in the research. This way, they could increase the workforce and speed of progress. In this, Ash said he was very grateful that Arthur had joined the research and believed that the future of the research would advance even more thanks to his observations. At that moment, the boy smiled happily and eagerly to help them even more. But for that, he would have to study the basics of agriculture first, and the others were ready to help him in that process. Yae just watched the children talking with a smile. She considered that perhaps the future of the city and even the kingdom could indeed be changed with dedicated minds like theirs. Even more time passed while they studied, and even though they hadn't managed to read much, they would certainly be able to progress eventually by continuing at this pace. It was all thanks to the support of Ash's allies, and he thanked the three for being there. The protagonist was happy with the situation and realized that going to study in the city was the right choice. Gaining knowledge, resources, and new connections was very valuable for the village and the well-being of the reconstruction of civilization. He remembered having said the same to Yuika in the past when they discussed creating a convenient and abundant life. To achieve such an ambitious dream, it wouldn't be possible to do all the work alone. Certainly dozens or even hundreds of people would show up to help him, and it still wouldn't be enough. He knew all of this even when he was living in the village, but being in the city now, he would be able to gain even greater support. The search for fertilizers was just the first step. As school activities began, Ash's goal would be to acquire valuable personal connections. Later, the reading classes at the temple would start. Soon there would also be military lessons, and so Yae explained to the children to wait for the teacher to arrive. To maintain the region's defenses, the younger ones learned the basics at the academy so they could train suitable leaders. Even from the village he came from, Klein was the one who usually guided the younger ones in times of emergency. After agreeing to study in the capital, the protagonist was advised to at least learn the basics of martial arts and spent some time training with Klein. If it weren't for the absence of the village chief during the bear attack, that mess would never have happened, and he would never have been at risk of his life. Ash wouldn't be surprised to hear that such a huge creature would be defeated by Klein with bare hands. Suddenly, the classroom doors open and a man named George appears. He greets Yae and says he hopes to lean on her guidance during the lessons. From the priestess's reaction, it was clear she liked George a little. In the meantime, the man looks in Ash's direction and stares at him, leaving the protagonist confused. Finally, George goes to the front of the class and explains that he was honored to be given the role of instructor despite being a known knight. When the classes ended, the protagonist felt it had been a very interesting time. During this period, they learned about military equipment, including weapons made from known metals, and a bit about the stone that forms the wall. Ash wanted to know more about the city's conditions and resources and the level of technology available, reflecting that even if he wanted to ask after class, he might be bothering him. Suddenly, George appears and asks if the boy has a moment to talk. After hearing about the protagonist's name and origin, the knight was sure of the doubts he had. In fact, George was David's cousin, which would make him Ash's uncle. It seemed that the boy's father had only briefly mentioned having knight relatives, but nothing more. Although they were short on time now, George would love to talk more with his nephew on another occasion. It was a pleasant surprise for Ash. Now the opportunities to get closer to him and gather information had increased considerably. Moreover, he was somewhat curious about his relationship with Yae. Later, he tells his friends about being related to the instructor, and Micah comments that the two kind of look alike. The girl thought so much during the day that she was starving and wondered if they would have dinner soon. Then, Arthur remembers something and comments that he would like to help them make the meals. Life in the dorms meant that the meal system was done on a rotating basis, and the students were responsible for preparing the shifts. In reality, the chefs were sent from the Lord's mansion in the city, and the children were their assistants. The task of preparing meals was divided by rooms, and this time it would be the responsibility of Ash, Arthur, Micah, and her roommate. The girl in question was Raina Vatil, who appears to greet the other three as soon as she is mentioned. Reina apologizes for not having gone to greet Ash earlier, even though she had met Micah in the room, but she had been quite busy since then. The protagonist doesn't worry about such details. Arthur comments on how that girl was always busy and was certainly working hard to find free time in her own schedule. In any case, he mentions that Reina was also capable of reading, writing, and calculating perfectly well, and the girl agrees, explaining that she came from a proud lineage of ladies-in-waiting who had served the Sakala family for generations. It was a real surprise to hear this. She must have had a great education. Ash immediately starts asking for the favor of helping them, and speaks so quickly that Reina barely understands anything. Somehow, the girl understands it was about some kind of research and agrees to help if there is something she can do. The protagonist is so happy that he almost lunges at her, causing Micah to have to hold him back and prevent him from scaring the roommate. After regaining his composure, Ash decides to return to the topic of them being responsible for cooking this time. Arthur feels a bit guilty for making the newcomers work so hard right after arriving, but they were responsible for this extra task this time. In fact, Arthur and Reina had been exempt from this kitchen task until now because they hadn't had roommates until then. On the other hand, the protagonist and Micah were prepared and excited to make the meals. Judging by their behavior, Arthur and Reina assumed they were used to working in the kitchen. Upon arriving at the location, they found a rather intimidating man waiting for them. He didn't care who they were or where they came from, but in the kitchen, none of that mattered, and from now on, he would treat those kids as apprentices. Ash introduces himself, and the man does the same, saying his name is Yak. The chef orders them all to wash their hands because they would be starting to work immediately. Since they had arrived at the dormitory the day before, both dinner and breakfast had been quite delicious. The protagonist wasn't particularly good at cooking in his previous life, but this time he managed to learn a bit more. He had thought it would be difficult to cook with such limitations in ingredients and equipment, but Yak managed to overcome the barrier of technology with talent. The result was Ash admiring Yak deeply, even in the smallest things. With how much the boy knew about food, the chef soon discovers that he was the son of farmers. The two get along so quickly that the other children are a bit shocked. In the end, they all work hard to prepare the evening meal. And in the process, Yak notices that Ash is good at teaching people, which makes the protagonist think it must be the case since he is used to it. Micah thanks him for always helping her, even though she is good at cooking after improving with her friend's advice. The chef is curious to know if Ash is really that good, and the girl explains that his recipes were quite popular in the village they came from, among the most delicious. Micah couldn't precisely define which were the best. If she had to choose, she would say the hamburger meat was incredible. Yak had never heard of that before, and Ash explains it is a small meatball he used to make. He suggests they could make it another time now that they would have pork and beef available in town. However, the chef cuts the subject and warns that the food market can be dangerous to buy from and would present them with better sources. At that moment, the protagonist feels grateful to realize they found someone with a good heart and suggests they could reward Yak by serving the hamburger later. That was a day full of precious encounters. Ash would like to ask George to teach him more about military matters, and Reina agreed to help with research on fertilizers. Finally, the chef would help him learn more cooking techniques. Thanks to so many amazing people, the protagonist feels that the path to his dream is becoming clearer and clearer. The next day, Ash thanks Reina for joining the study group, and as a result, they were able to gather even more information. They had discovered that there were various types of fertilizers, each with different effects. Since leaving the village, the protagonist had been so focused on chemical fertilizers that he considered some would have to be postponed, so it would be necessary to do an alternative project using animal bones, plus composite materials would take longer to make. Due to the nature of this type of work, it would be difficult to ask girls to help him get their hands dirty. There were still several other factors to think about, but if everything goes well, then surely the harvests would increase significantly. One day, Ash wanted to scale up production so they could sell to other cities and villages. This would be called an agricultural improvement plan. During the research, a problem arose related to the fact that using composite materials was strictly prohibited. A long time ago, it seemed there was an incident where human excrement was used in compost, resulting in a large-scale epidemic that ruined an entire city. Since then, humanity began to believe that composite materials were dangerous, and animal ones must be even worse. However, Ash knew they were safe to use as long as they were properly managed. In order to conduct the experiments, they would have to prove to Itsuki the safety of their use to start. They would write some hygiene protocols. Thus, the protagonist tells everyone to focus on books related to medicine, and each of them sighs in exhaustion. Later, the planning was complete, and they would first have to discuss with the dorm supervisor named Rin. Apparently, after reviewing the content the students were reading, she reported it to the Regent Lord. In fact, Rin was one of the highest-class ladies among the vassals of Sakula and served as the dorm supervisor in her free time, also being Reina's mother. On another day, while they were waiting for Itsuki's approval regarding the rules, George suddenly appeared. He came to ask Ash to inform the students that there would be no time for class this time, and instead, there would be a study session. The night was quite busy, and considering that man was known as one of the most reliable of the Lord, and must receive several special requests. Although Ash doesn't understand much about military matters, when it comes to managing supplies, he could at least lend a hand. In that case, the protagonist suggests he would like to observe his uncle's work and perhaps offer some assistance. George hesitated to agree, so the nephew continues saying he can help carry items or do calculations. At this, the knight remembers that Ash is good at studying literature and arithmetic. In that case, he ends up agreeing to the proposal because he also wouldn't have much time to talk to him if they waited for free time to arrive. Micah tells her friend not to worry as she would pass on the instructor's message to the rest of the class. As expected of Ash, he was quite quick when it came to wanting to learn new things, and this makes the girl laugh. A little later, the protagonist went to the military stockpile in the capital, and he realized, somewhat shocked, that he would have to work to sort everything out. While they needed to store each item, they would have to check for damages and decide which could be repaired and which would have to be discarded. Aside from the number of items, the small number of people who would help with the task only made everything more exhausting. This was because in emergency cases, large quantities of military supplies were kept in reserve so that the knights could fight without worry. In fact, they would have to check the stockpile again this year, and the protagonist nearly fainted from shock. This enormous amount of work could not be completed by such a small group of people. Moreover, it was strange to put a knight like George in charge of this, and Ash wondered if there was a hidden reason for it. So, the boy suggested to his uncle that they might need to re-evaluate their equipment production management. They could create small teams of people and have leaders who would report the results. If teamwork worked, it would be more efficient. Tasks that anyone could do could be left to others, considering there must be various other things George should be doing right now. The knight understood and agreed with his nephew's point of view. This perspective was quite valuable, and therefore the man would like to continue receiving Ash's assistance from time to time. In fact, the boy even wanted to be seen as a sort of apprentice. After all, they were related by blood and should trust each other as family. These words made George start to laugh, but he decided to agree with his suggestion nonetheless. After helping the knight with the tasks, Ash wrote a proposal for new management methods for the equipment and presented it to Itsuki. When meeting with the Lord, the protagonist was the one who explained the contents, and this made him recognized as a good assistant. As a result, the boy was duly rewarded. But instead of receiving a gift for the suggestion, Ash wished that the Lord of the city prioritize confirming the report that Rin had sent. Itsuki remembered it was about the agricultural improvement plan and agreed with the idea of confirming the proposal. Ash was super happy to know this because now he would be able to work through practical means in his research. Several days passed, and since then, the protagonist's study group became officially sanctioned by the Lord. However, since they planned to use organic compounds, something taboo until then, it was strictly limited only to the vegetable gardens of the dormitory. Someday, to scale up production, they would have to prove that this research was safe. However, everyone at the academy looked at Ash's work with disdain. This was because the boy was processing the necessary products for hygienic uses. Although they were approving the idea of using permitted means, they were all somewhat shocked to see with their own eyes because it was rarely seen even in the royal capital. Most products of this type were reserved for the royal family. Ash wondered if the royalty's monopolization was the reason they couldn't find hygiene materials easily. Then, the boy mentioned that he was preparing soap, and Rin was so surprised that she almost fainted. Ignoring her, Micah commented to his friend that the current reaction of the product should mean it was ready. As always, Ash would test it on himself to check its safety. Arthur was impressed that the secret formula of the Royce family had been replicated so easily. He heard that soaps were sold by them through influential merchants. Meanwhile, Rin didn't even know how she would report what she was witnessing now to the Lord of the City because if it was a matter treated carelessly, it could cause conflicts with merchants. More days passed, and this time Ash took a step forward to go outside the city wall. And to prove the effectiveness of the sanitary products, he wanted to ask for the collaboration of a certain group of people. On the other hand, the reception of these men was anything but warm. These guys were convicts from the city who had been assigned by Itsuki to work dirtying their hands collecting organic materials. To start, the protagonist would have to test the effects of the soap he created and improve sanitary conditions. If it worked, they could change the tasks of the convicts, and Ash would love to increase the number of allies. But the current situation wasn't helping. One of the men complained to the protagonist about hating people who saw them as less important and pushed him. Instead of being bothered by this reaction, Ash knew that the violent man was named Belgo and decided to talk. Ash knew about the convicts' origins, who came from a family of carpenters and was the youngest of the children, with his older brother having taken over their parents' business. At first, Belgo questions whether the boy was trying to gain something from them, but that wasn't the case. Ash wanted to rely on everyone's work and was curious about the kind of person that condemned man was, so he asked the lord of the city to introduce him. In fact, the boy was sure that Belgo had his reasons for leaving home and asked if he was still capable of working as a carpenter. The man agreed, but in a place like this where they were, the chances of showcasing his skills were low. The nearby warehouses were built by him and the protagonist praised him for having such skill. However, Belgo said that talent was insignificant if it wasn't possible to succeed in the family business. Faced with his reaction, the boy suggested the chance for the carpenter to showcase his skills while being rewarded for it. After hesitating for a moment, the man ended up agreeing, which made the protagonist very happy. It was a relief because he had been unsure how he could build the shelters for the compounds, so having him on the team would be a great help. To start, Ash would need him to conduct the soap tests. When he used it on his own, he felt no irritation or pain on his skin, but he wanted to make Belgo and the others check for any problems. It would be quicker to use it than to explain, so the boy dragged the man to do a demonstration. To begin with, Ash asked Belgo to take off his clothes, which made him embarrassed and furious. But the boy laughed at his display of immaturity. After all, even after a child had tried to use the cleaning product, seeing an adult refuse to do so out of fear was tarnishing Belgo's reputation. After being so clearly challenged, the carpenter did as requested and turned his back. The protagonist took the opportunity to apply the soap to a specific area of skin and showed everyone the results. The area became perfectly clean to the point of shining. At that point, Ash let Belgo use the soap on his own this time. Moreover, he told all the other convicts to do the same so they could check the test results on various bodies. He also explained that these products could be used to wash clothes. The men were all quite shocked and impressed because now they could enjoy meals properly. Belgo asked why he was doing all this for them, and Ash replied that basic hygiene should be a fundamental requirement for anyone, as low sanitary conditions would increase the chance of an epidemic. Since those convicts in particular did not have death sentences, they had to live healthily and as civilized as possible. There were many people like them who came from families of carpenters but ended up being abandoned by their parents due to financial problems. They were treated as burdens and forced to leave home, surviving on the streets and committing crimes. If their families had at least enough food to start with, they would never have been forced into that situation. From now on, the work that Ash would like to ask of all of them might be difficult, but would also be very crucial. If the project succeeded, they could increase food supplies for the entire city. Thus, there would be no more people suffering from hunger, and it would be fitting to have those convicts helping him while trying to survive. Their strength would be important for improving the city's future. Belgo had no idea about most of what that boy was trying to say. However, if it meant that they could all have some usefulness, then they were willing to help. The other convicts agreed. It had been a long time since they were needed by someone, and they were excited to do so. Their reaction delighted the protagonist, who thanked them, quite happy to have gained new allies. As time passed, everything seemed to be quite calm, and it should have been fine having excellent individuals working at the academy. However, Itsuki was shocked to hear that they were making soaps and wondered how students gained access to the secret formula. It was hard to believe that Ash was truly such a brilliant mind at this point. Due to this intense situation, the lord of the city had to ask for help from his subordinates, and Rin was the first to say that from now on he would have to be very vigilant. Ye was equally impressed with Ash's work. As a cleric of the temple, they were devoted to the god of knowledge and would love to continue dedicating efforts to help that boy. Itsuki was shocked that that woman refused to make the report, thinking there was a slightest chance the Lord would stop Ash's project. However, the truth was that he did not intend to stop his intelligent mind from continuing to study and was certainly the sensitive type. On the other hand, all the subordinates disagreed with that observation. Rin mentions that Ash's performance at the academy was progressing well and the development plan in agriculture would directly impact Itsuki. Faced with the determination of those three to support the boy, the Lord wonders if Ash won their hearts so quickly. Soon George asks the Lord to support the protagonist, as he would certainly do everything possible to achieve his own dream. This makes Itsuki sigh, wondering what exactly Klein was thinking by sending that boy to the city. Meanwhile, Ash went to meet the condemned again to seek their help. Since the boy was able to engage with the group, his life changed to assist with the manual labor of construction. The tasks were quite tough, and when the mixture of organic compounds heated up, the horrible smell almost made Ash vomit. Precisely because it made those men dirty their hands, Ash tried to compensate them with various goods and great gratitude. The food was especially well received to the point that some of the condemned began to cook for themselves as well. Thus, a few months passed, spring came to an end, and summer approached, marking the end of the manual work of creating fertilizers. Once they tried using it on the garden vegetables, the results proved fruitful. Even Rin was impressed to see how healthy and grand the harvests were this time. There was a clear difference in the quality of the tomatoes to which they used the organic compounds, but they couldn't draw definitive conclusions so quickly. Micah knew that everyone in the village would be happy if they could take these products to the fields. While their work was a success, they still had to prepare to create several other fertilizers and test the effectiveness of each one depending on the conditions. Thus, all allies were now important, and Ash would need their help. On another day, Arthur noticed that the protagonist was writing down the results of the tests and usually summarized the experiments he did every day. The details to be confirmed in the future would involve using chicken compounds, and they also had to check the change in the amount of livestock. The more Ash was adding things to do, the more Arthur was shocked by how greedy his friend was being. Until the protagonist laughed, and Arthur realized he had been noticed for much longer. He approached to complain, then jumped back again, embarrassed. Ash didn't mind this and mentioned that he might have written a bit more than necessary this time. Deep down, he had indeed provoked Arthur because it was funny to see him react with such surprise, and he couldn't help it. In this, the boy mentioned that he always saw the protagonist very busy and was worried that he was working too much. He had never done anything like researching new technologies before, and it was actually quite fun. Ash was happy to see this and said there would be even more cool things to do from then on, so he didn't want to waste plans for the future even if he wouldn't be there someday. Therefore, they should make the most of what they could. At that moment, Arthur reflected on the amount of work to be done and how much he was capable of doing, and wondered if he would be able to continue helping so much. This made him think back to the time when he could still be a girl and admired cute clothes and bags. However, anything she did was reason for people to create unfounded gossip about supporting a certain group or person. Even simple things like looking outside at a bird made them theorize about wanting to abandon tasks. It seemed that everything the girl did was reason to suspect someone or think there was some manipulation behind it. Not only that, but they blamed her as if she didn't understand the impact of her actions, and the employees continued to gossip non-stop. Since then, she decided that she wouldn't say or ask for anything. She would have to endure the silence even if it hurt and stung. It was so cold and lonely that it made her feel like she could freeze to death. Suddenly, Ash's voice appeared and pulled her out of that darkness, making her open her eyes. Arthur woke up somewhat surprised to see his friend, who had woken him in the middle of the night after noticing he was crying in his sleep. Apparently, he had had a terrifying nightmare, but everything was fine now. Ash suggested making a cup of tea and even brought some herbs from the village for times like this. Instead of seeing this action as an obligation, the protagonist suggested to Arthur to see it as a celebration of the fact that he was feeling better. It was the boy's way of trying to comfort him, and although he was insistent, it was quite kind. When Arthur drank the tea, he realized it had a pleasant taste. Then, Ash shared that those herbs had a personal story in his village and had a relaxing effect. The two talk about the test of the organic compound that worked and impressed everyone. Arthur finds it truly amazing that it has come this far. When he discovered that using manure was taboo, he diligently studied a way to gain approval. Seeing that he didn't have enough people to work with, he found reliable allies and earned their trust. Not only that, but he even helped someone like Arthur, who knew very little about agriculture, and dedicated himself to teaching him. This made the time he spent at the academy quite enjoyable, and he was really grateful that Ash had come to study at the academy. Compared to the real capital, he was always finding interesting things to do. It was only after becoming friends with Ash that he was able to enjoy those emotions from the bottom of his heart. Moreover, without him, it was possible that the others at the academy would continue to see him as the child of the Count's family, and nothing more. If he was going to be exploited regardless, then he preferred at least to be seen for who he was, not just by lineage or status. His desire was for people to see him at least a little. Arthur soon apologizes because he got lost in the conversation and vented too much. And Ash comments that he doesn't know exactly what kind of life he has had so far, but there was one thing he knew. The truth was that Arthur wasn't bothered by being used, but because others wanted to hurt him emotionally. Certainly there would be those who approached with bad intentions, and emotional pain was not something that could be handled by human hands. However, all the protagonist could do now was at least listen to what his friend had to say now that they were side by side. Besides, not everyone in this world would be malicious. There would also be those who think of asking for help instead of using him, and that was the case with Ash himself. Arthur wonders if he was really able to help his colleague to the point of balancing the amount of kindness he received, and the protagonist replies that yes, for a long time he had been receiving support and valuable comments. He was happy to have found Arthur because now they could spend good time together. These words make the boy cry, emotional, and happy to have had such joyful days. Moreover, he thanks Ash for listening to his outburst. In the middle of the conversation, the protagonist remembers something about the work they had to do. Soon, he would like to know more about other cities, so he would need to find a map. However, according to Yai, there was nothing like that in the temple. This makes him consider that he might have to ask Rin, and Arthur paused to think about it too. Later, the boy appears with a map he managed to get due to a very specific situation and wanted to gift it to the protagonist. Ash is shocked and excited at the same time. After all, having him as a roommate was really worth it because he was quite reliable. It was truly fantastic. With this, they could start preparing distribution plans for the future. But as soon as he opened the map, what he saw immediately surprised him. Not only did it show the area around the city, but also the entire world. Arthur explains that there was the Mountain of the Dragon's Roar located just north of the country of Sakula. They said that this mountain was so high it reached the top of the world, and having the dragon above it made sense. Further down the map, there was a large snake drawn by the ocean, and they said it was the sea dragon. Since there were creatures that attacked humans if they got too close, there were specific markings for where they could live. Ash couldn't believe how full of fantasy history that map was. The surroundings of the city were always filled with dangerous monsters that confined humanity. In part, he wanted to believe it was just metaphorical, but he set that aside. Instead, he asked about the center of the map that was marking the real capital, and on the right was Sakula. This was strange because it should actually be to the south, and technically the Dragon's Mountain is to the north. However, Arthur replies that maps only serve to indicate routes, and thus directions shouldn't matter much. The protagonist is startled to hear this, as just as he feared, that map was a complete mess. He can't even believe they would make such a mistake when such a thing was used as a practical travel guide. Although he is quite grateful to Arthur for bringing the map, it was just a list of directions written without any order. Instead, it should be the pinnacle of optics, mathematics, and survival techniques, being a miniature of the world created through effort. However, that map was simply ridiculous for anyone wanting to try to explore the world. Arthur is left confused because it was very dangerous to walk through uncharted areas, and the vast majority of people did not want to take such risks. However, there was a tale about times before Sakula was born. They said there were failures and various sacrifices in the attempt to create this region. These lands were somewhat far from the Dragon Mountain, and it was the first Lord of the Border who, after going through several hardships, finally arrived at a suitable place to live. That's how Sakula was born, and the unexplored places Ash mentioned must be very dangerous to go to. The protagonist agrees that this is the case, but the very kingdom where they now lived was an unconquered place. It was because of the efforts of these people that they could live in peace and safety now. If hundreds of people were to start a journey in the middle of a wild area, perhaps only one would make it out alive. But if there were a map showing points of interest and which ones to avoid, it was possible that almost all lives could be spared. Now Arthur understands better why Ash was furious seeing how poorly made that map was. If they could create more suitable guides, then the world could be safer and allow people to live happily. Arthur realizes that his friend was right, as he himself had the chance to live a greater and better life since he moved. He wonders how vast the world can really be and can't even imagine. Having a map filled with black spaces didn't seem like it would be useful. On the other hand, Ash believes there are many people who would be able to fill that empty space as they explore the unknown. Despite the risks, everyone has their own reasons to seek out new things. Some try to escape from where they are now, and others just want to explore new places. There were, for example, deep forests where one could find new species of plants never before seen in the world, and a beautiful lake or village full of people. Who knows if they could go even further and find a cave that shines with precious stones or traces of torches. The more they imagine, the more possibilities could grow and expand so that the blank spaces of knowledge could be filled in. Arthur is impressed by his friend's way of speaking, as at this pace he ended up feeling curious too. That's why there must certainly be people who travel merely out of curiosity. All because learning new things can always be quite fun. If there's a chance, then Ash would love to try to explore those unknown lands too in some sort of adventure. It was the peak of romanticism, and this kind of imagination made Arthur laugh a little too. In light of this reaction, the protagonist suggests that they should go together if the opportunity arises. This is because he believed that his friend was the type who would lose patience staying in a routine and would quickly get ready for an adventure as soon as the opportunity came up. Even if Arthur stammers that this isn't the case, Ash keeps laughing because his colleague has always been curious about asking questions and would clearly love to go on an exploration. For the sake of this grand adventure, the protagonist was willing to add even more maps to his list of wishes for the future. As a result, the list of objectives for the future only tended to get bigger and better. Arthur wonders what it feels like to imagine so many wonders and explore a world that just extends over time. It was only by traveling to Sakura that he could have fun for the first time in his life, and now that he knew there were other places like that too, he couldn't help but feel curious. It just reminds him of when the maids themselves mocked her for any action she took. On the other hand, imagining the possibilities for the future makes him want to dream once again. With this in mind, Arthur comments that his friend was always quite busy. If that were the case, then it was possible that the creation of maps wouldn't start so soon, and there wasn't much to be done considering the current plan for agricultural improvement. That's why he was willing to take on this task and try to create a new map. This took Ash by surprise, but apparently, his earlier words convinced him to go this far. Besides, Arthur believes that being the youngest son of the Count of Sakula, it was perfect to use his position to his advantage to gather geographical information. The protagonist notices the excitement in his eyes and decides to pass this important mission on to his friend. To start, the boy would have to get in touch with all the nearby towns and perhaps find merchants to ask about the roads. It would be great if he could travel around the world on his own, but it would certainly be quite difficult to achieve. Ash agrees that this seems like a dream coming true, but there was a method to measure the size of the world. This kind of thing was not something Arthur was familiar with, but he was quite curious to know what it was. In this, the protagonist tries to think of the appropriate way to explain the situation. So he starts by talking about how the world they live in now is a sphere like a wolf, and Arthur replies that he only heard about it directly from a cleric of the church, even though maps are drawn in square shapes. The friend again tries to explain that it was information based on the movement of the sun and stars, but for now, they should assume it was correct to avoid complications. Ash draws a circle on the paper that represents the world and divides it into 16 equal parts, removing only one of them. That piece that came out of the circle was as small as his pinky finger. But another way to see this was that the full size of the circle was made up of those 16 smaller cutouts. Now Arthur could understand the method to estimate the size of the world, and it would be good to start knowing the distance from there to the royal capital. However, he wonders how many of these sessions would be necessary to calculate the total area. In this, the protagonist comments on there being a sun pillar outside each temple. When the sunlight hits it, a shadow is formed. But at the same time during the day, the length of each shadow would change according to the location. If, for example, the pillar does not cast a shadow, it means the sun is directly overhead. In other words, the places where the light marks would create an angle. With this information in mind and knowing the location of each of them, they would be able to know the space between the parts. By comparing the angles, they could discover which fraction of the circle they belong to and find the distance between each pillar. Then, Arthur becomes curious to know if they would be able to calculate the size of the entire world this way. With the smile coming from his friend, he was impressed to discover this. It was simply amazing that they could make a map with mathematics in mind and acquiring more information about the geographical points. The boy was amazed and eager to start working on this new project as quickly as possible. Later during dinner, Arthur asked the Lord if there were other places that do not cast shadows during noon. And Itsuki, clearly exhausted, replied that he had heard something about that. There was a city to the south of their territory probably, but he was left wondering why such interest. And the boy replied it was nothing much, just something he had been thinking about. Although Arthur wanted to discuss the plans with the Lord, he decided to leave it for another day as he didn't want to burden him further. Itsuki asked if the boy had heard about all this from the academy, but instead of answering the question, Arthur became concerned about the Lord's state, as he was clearly tired to the point of not having dinner yet. On the other hand, he thought that if he slept now, he would be unable to wake up for 2 consecutive days. Putting the subject aside, Itsuki turned his attention back to the academy, wanting to know how the studies were going, and with a shy smile, the boy said that the days had been quite fun. Despite the Lord being worried, Arthur assured him he was serious as Micah and Reina were very kind to him. Besides that, he had been spending a very pleasant time with Ash and had learned several things recently. Hearing this made the man understand that it was indeed the right choice to trust Yuika's intuition, and it was true that before, Arthur had been a bit nervous when he first met the newcomer. He would be living with a new roommate, and well before meeting Ash, he had been anxious about someone knowing his hidden identity. Although Arthur was not in a position to demand, living with a boy might not be appropriate. Itsuki understood his concerns and even suggested that he live in the Lord's mansion if that situation was too uncomfortable. On the other hand, Yuika, who was talented at understanding others, heard about the situation and suggested putting Ash and Arthur in the same room. That was why they did things that way and decided to trust her. Now that some time had passed, Arthur was sure it was the right thing to do. That was why he was grateful to the Lord for accepting him into the Sakula family and doing his best to make him comfortable. The boy's smile made Itsuki regain his enthusiasm to return to work and recover. Meanwhile, Ash was still surprised that his roommate had become so excited about the maps. Moreover, when one usually drew one by hand, there would always be significant challenges to deal with, like the various proportions and the distance traveled using a carriage in the sunlight. This kind of thing can make space calculation quite imprecise, so one should be very careful. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to take an arbitrary measure for personal use for now. But seeing how excited Arthur was to measure the world, the protagonist smiles to himself. Since he had gone so far in convincing his friend, they might as well move forward and do as much as possible for this new project. That being said, it had been a while since he last saw him, but Ash decided to see Quid and discuss something important. At the same time, Arthur presented his new dream of drawing a map for Rin, and for that, he would need to gather as much information as possible. But considering he was always trying to hide his own identity, he wanted to be careful not to expose himself too much. Because of this, he decided to ask the dormitory supervisor for help. Then, Rin mentions that the location where no shadows appeared was a city known as Hika. The woman received the Lord's word to serve the boy as an attendant and intended to fulfill her duty without fail. Arthur was amazed because even though Itsuki had been exhausted recently, he was still able to remember the request he had made. In any case, the supervisor asks what other types of information he needed to gather, and the boy explains that he would love to know about the distance and direction to each city and village. But since travel varied between people and horses, various recordings would be necessary. It was important for the creation of the New World map to gather as many details as possible. In this, Rin begins explaining that if they were to start with the province of Sakula, it wouldn't be a problem. As long as they avoided making any improper information, then activities conducted at the academy could be approved by the lord of the city, and the boy becomes worried about possibly causing problems by showing the map he had before to Ash. The supervisor comments that in general, they had information used for territory management and defenses. Normally, they couldn't disclose it without permission, so technically it would have been inappropriate, but she wasn't in a position to say for sure. Arthur apologizes for placing such a heavy burden on Rin, but the woman was happy to help as much as she could. It was perfectly fine for the boy to try to learn using all the experiences he gained over time. The two agree to always talk before making any drastic decisions and to support each other as much as possible. In terms of being careful, if the plans were to gather details from other provinces, it was necessary to create an action plan to not overstep any boundaries. This was because the information they would collect could very well be important to the lord of each territory, and if they acted suspiciously, it would result in problems. After thinking for a bit, Arthur suggests that they use his real name in this case. At first, the supervisor is worried even though revealing the boy's secret identity could significantly improve negotiations. Arthur heard that to confuse his true whereabouts, they created a story saying that his true self went to a very different place. If that were the case, then they could pretend that after that, Arthur's true identity decided to expand his horizons and wanted to explore other places. Rin acknowledges that it was an excellent suggestion, and they should start preparations for it soon. In light of the supervisor's readiness, Arthur thanks her and praises how dedicated she was to helping him. On the other hand, the woman recommends that he shouldn't speak so highly of her, or it could cause problems. At that moment, the boy was left confused, and Rin explains that if a member of the Lord's family says such things, it would be difficult to make serious decisions later. In response to her criticism, Arthur decides to comply with her request and asks if there was anything else he could do. The woman retorts that they should involve the family of the Viscount of Sakuna from the beginning. Their house was renowned for its ability to gather information, and they must know a lot about geography. Who knows? Using Arthur's real name, they might make them contribute wholeheartedly to the research. Moreover, there would be no need for the boy to get involved with small details. It would be enough to trust the task to someone close. To identify these tasks, it would be appropriate to hire specific people and recognize them properly when they finish what they were assigned to do. This skill was the most necessary for those who try to lead. Arthur is amazed by this advice and thanks Rin again for her words. After that, the boy became quite anxious for the supervisor's next report, so he began trying to gather other relevant information in any way he could, talking to other people around. After so much hustle, Ash was impressed by the amount of documents accumulated by his friend. Since they managed to get a huge pile of these, Arthur decides to start organizing the papers by region. The protagonist decides to help him because it was too much work for just one person. In this, he also asked for the assistance of Micah and Reina, who answered the call. Although Arthur is happy to see them so eager, he still wanted to do this task on his own and would be working on it until it was finished. It was a real shock for the other three children. Reina comments that her mother was worried about the boy for having an enormous amount of things to do by himself. The best thing to do should always be to use those around him to lighten the burden he carried. On the other hand, Arthur replies that he learned to do this with attendance, but his relationship with friends was quite different. These words made Reina laugh because if the boy saw them this way, there was even more reason to help him. When they saw a friend going through difficulties, the most natural thing to do was to offer assistance. Reina extends her hand for Arthur to hold, but then Ash and Micah interrupt by holding all their hands together at once. This chaotic scene makes everyone laugh, and in the end, the quartet decides to work together on the reports. It didn't take long for them to see that reorganizing all the documents would take quite a bit of time. The descriptions of each paper were inconsistent, and they would have to figure out the directions on their own. Even with all this, Ash notes that knowing whether the nearest temple was to the south or north of Hika would be quite complicated. For now, they could leave the calculations for later to prioritize consolidating the information they had. Arthur thought it would be better to change everything to a fixed distance before preparing the map, and the protagonist agreed because the uniformity of a unit was quite suitable. Based on how far common travelers go when describing the journey, it would be better to define the day's walk as the distance covered on foot during the time the sun moves across the globe. Using the walk as a means of calculation was not a very precise method since each person's stride was different. And just then, Ash decides it would be a convenient time to reveal the special drawing tools he managed to get for drawing. Arthur was shocked that his friend prepared all this in advance, believing it would be necessary. It took a lot of work to do, and in fact, the artisans had to walk in circles repeatedly while carrying a rope. All this so they could define the number of steps for an entire day's walk. In fact, as soon as Ash convinced Quid, he managed to acquire good funding. In this case, he hoped they could use everything that was available and useful. In this, Arthur mentions that these tools would be great for measuring more precise distances, and since they had never made a map before, Ash believes they could start by narrowing the scope of the region just for the draft. To begin with, they compared the various reports coming from a small area. They matched each of them with the positions in relation to the other cities and villages. Little by little, they were able to mark the distances more accurately. After what seemed like long hours, Arthur exclaimed when he found what they were looking for in the city south of Hika, the one without shadows. It seemed to be near a region called Kagetsu and was within the territory of Viscount Sukuna. In this case, when they measured the distance between Hika of Sakula and Kagetsu of Sukuna, they could then calculate the size of the world. Arthur was so excited that he practically shouted as he ran out to contact Rin. Meanwhile, Reina decides she will continue with their progress. His friends comment with huge smiles on the fact that Arthur has changed so much. A little later, they manage to finish gathering the information and drawing it on paper. To start, Arthur makes it clear that this map was made with everyone's cooperation and therefore was credit to all four at once. There were some areas that lacked information, but they possibly managed to be as accurate as possible. With the numbers they acquired, they would be able to learn more about this enormous world. The city of Hika was at a certain point, and right next to it was Kagetsu. The distance between them was around 1,944 days of walking in a straight line. Since they found the shadow of a certain angle, they could do the calculations using it. Thus, the size of the world was 243,000 days of walking. Arthur was amazed with himself and with the discovery they made. Although they call it a world map, what was there was just a small portion of it. The entire world was still hundreds of times larger than that. The children were excited about the idea of making a version with the entire globe, even if it ended up being so large that it would take up an entire room. Ash suggests they collect different maps from various smaller maps to put in the museum, and in the center, place the colossal version as the main highlight. They continue to discuss amidst laughter and sighs, and this scene makes Arthur happy too. The boy believes that if they are all together, he wouldn't have to hold back anymore. If there was anything else that needed to be done, then it would all be fine, even if he was capable of doing anything. Now that he understood this, Arthur was determined to someday embark on a great adventure to explore the world. The protagonist was happy that they were able to finish the map. Reina agreed since her mother ended up being quite surprised to see the completed result. However, Arthur knew he was far from perfection. It seemed that the greater the distance, the less accurate their drawing would become. There were places that lacked information, and given the limitations, they would have no choice but to list as many cities and villages as they could for now. After hearing what Ash wanted to say about doing various tests until achieving the right result, Arthur now began to understand better in practice. Once they finished a project, what was missing to perfect it became quite obvious. If they were to consider the uses for the future, then who knows, a map of the entire province should be good to obtain. It would be quite useful, and so Arthur decided he would ask Rin. The protagonist commented that it was always amazing to have him around for being so reliable. Even though Arthur felt embarrassed by the compliments, Ash kept talking. After all, they were roommates and he saw him wake up quite early and sleep late at night. Thanks to his efforts, the work that would have taken much longer for the protagonist to finish was done at an admirable speed. At that point, he didn't even know how he could thank him. At that moment, Micah felt something strange as those two were getting quite close, and this only became more obvious as Ash continued to say that no matter how many compliments he offered, it would never be enough deep down. Arthur had gained great respect and gratitude from him, and hoped to continue counting on his help in the future. These words left the boy visibly happy, and Micah froze in shock once again at this. This was because this reaction was exactly like that of a girl. Micah's mind began to get confused as this situation was getting really ugly. She wondered why Arthur was hiding his own gender and acted like this around Ash. In that, the protagonist noticed that the girl had stopped walking for some reason and turned to ask why. Then, Micah quickly resumed talking as if nothing had happened, although she was worried about the situation. Since then, she had been distracted and avoided her friends, which left them quite confused. The tension grew so much that when the girl tripped and Ash tried to help her, she avoided him and ran away while apologizing. Micah wondered if she was mistaken and if perhaps she was overthinking. On the other hand, the expression on Arthur's face was clear as day regarding his feelings. The girl didn't understand why he was disguising himself and still shared the same room with Ash. It wasn't fair that only Micah had to stay in the girls' dormitory. At the same time, she wondered if the protagonist hadn't noticed this. Perhaps he even had but pretended not to. None of this made much sense, especially since Micah's heart was aching now. Remembering how grateful Ash was to his friend for everything he did left her uncomfortable. After all, she had also helped with all the work on the map and making the organic compounds. In that, she remembered her mother's words warning her to be careful, especially because there was a chance that someday Ash might become fond of someone who wasn't her. And Micah wondered if she was really doing her best to support him. After all, Arthur was impressive in doing an entire task alone, and that was the reason he received all of Ash's attention. As she wondered what she should do, Raina appeared in the room to check if her friend was feeling better. She said that Ash and Arthur were quite worried after seeing her run away. Concerned that something had happened, Raina asked the boys to calm down since everything was certainly fine, and hoped that neither of them suspected anything. However, she was willing to listen to Micah's problems if there was something hurting her friend's heart. After hesitating for a moment, the girl began to try to explain why she was being distant. Micah asked what to do when a friendship suddenly starts to go wrong and becomes painful. Raina replied that if she were the one at fault, then she would be the first to apologize. But if that wasn't the case, it was hard to say. That wasn't the answer the girl was looking for, because now she couldn't even face her friend who was trying to help her. At that moment, Raina could only tell by her expression that there were times when one wished to say something to someone but couldn't do so, which became a problem. This situation might end up causing them to fight and perhaps grow to dislike each other. However, Raina believes that if her friend was worrying too much to the point of being distressed, it means it was something she wanted resolved because she cared for that person. Micah understands her own feelings a bit better now. She was agonizing because both Ash and Arthur were important people. After all, if a person was truly precious, then it was normal for any misunderstanding to be resolved appropriately. Thus, the best thing to do would be to gather all the courage possible and try to take the first step. Micah agrees with her friend's words and knows she is right, so she would spend some time reflecting on it. Above all, Raina wanted to ensure they never forget the friends who were there to support them. Since then, Micah has been wondering what she should do to get closer to her friends again and talk about the situation. She would like to help Ash even more, but she feels incapable of doing so. Arthur must feel the same way, and it was hard to admit, but she didn't believe she was wrong in this situation. Micah wanted to understand why Arthur was trying to hide his own gender. If neither of them said anything about it, it meant that the reason for keeping a secret identity was because there were serious circumstances behind it. In that case, she wonders what she should do because it was quite difficult to decide. If it worked like studying, then she would be able to find an answer written in some book. That's when Micah realizes she had to do exactly that, but not for Ash or for Arthur, but for herself. At that moment, the girl ran through the Lord's mansion and ignored Rin's pleas to wait. This was because she wanted to talk about something important regarding Arthur. Although Itsuki tries to play dumb, Micah insists because she wouldn't be fooled now that she knew that boy was actually a girl. The two stare intensely at each other until the Lord sighs, giving up. As expected of her, his niece was indeed quite clever and capable of reading between the lines. After all, Micah was also part of that household and would eventually discover the truth. This was a very serious matter, so the Lord wanted her to stay calm and pay attention. After some time explaining, the girl was able to understand Arthur's origins. Hiding his identity was just for safety, and entering the academy was part of the disguise. It wasn't just because Arthur was suffering from slander about himself, but there would certainly be those who would target her life. That was the reason everyone was working hard to protect her. In the royal capital, despite numerous attempts to keep that girl's life safe, the reality was that there was no one who looked at her life favorably. Arthur himself apologized for causing problems for everyone all the time. Itsuki couldn't believe he let such an absurdity happen. That pain haunted him no matter where he went, and he had been holding it inside for years. That's why Arthur was usually seen with a distant and sad face most of the time. Micah remembers when she met him, and how that made a lot of sense now. And she questions why there are such horrible people. It should be okay for Arthur to be angry and cry for help. The Lord agrees with her words, but not acting discreetly was too dangerous. Despite everything, Micah recognizes her friend's pain and knows it must be unbearable. Thus, she wishes he could live happily after they had spent so much time having fun together and studying side by side. Arthur always seemed reserved, but deep down he was quite curious about the world. There were times she saw him running towards Ash full of life and smiles, but there were also situations where he was kind and considerate to others. Even when Micah was unable to look Arthur in the face, he cared a lot about her well-being. They had been spending a lot of time together, and because of that, his life improved a lot. The girl was able to see all of her friend's qualities. Thus, it should be okay to have more fun because no one deserved to go through such bad experiences. In the face of Micah's frustrated tears, her uncle simply comforts her, agreeing silently. After the girl calms down and can process everything that happened, she is sure that Arthur's life has always been quite difficult. Being able to enjoy life while learning new things was something Micah understood well. It was true that part of her couldn't help but feel jealous when she saw him always by Ash's side. However, she couldn't help but wish for her friend to have a good life. Besides, his skills were really very important for Ash. From now on, the number of people who would show up to help him would certainly increase. Among them, there would be those who felt attracted to Ash. It was only a matter of time for that to happen, and it was certainly wonderful. Despite everything, Ash was special to Micah, and she wanted to be recognized more than ever. Therefore, regardless of what others think, no matter how many approach him, her affection would never change. The feelings she had were not like those of others. Regardless of what happens from now on, Micah was determined to help him achieve the dream he had. In the meantime, she would always see him from behind so she could protect and support him. With that in mind, the girl stands up and decides she would talk to Arthur in person. Itsuki is startled by the idea, but Micah assures him she wouldn't say anything to anyone. However, there was something quite important she needed to discuss with her friend. Later, she calls him to walk so they can talk privately. The first thing she does is apologize to Arthur for acting strange the other day, as there were several things on her mind that worried her. The boy wasn't hurt, but he questions what exactly they were going to discuss. Then Micah confesses that she loved Ash, but not just him. She also adored Arthur and Reina. It was quite sudden, so the boy was confused, but he thanks her anyway. In fact, Micah enjoyed studying and spending time with friends and wanted to get closer to everyone even more than before. Precisely because the two felt the same way, the girl would like to become closer to Arthur. Therefore, she wanted to hear if there was anything he wanted to do. Moreover, she didn't want to hear apologies or concerns from Arthur, considering it was a request from Micah herself. She was happy to see him leaning on her like that and preferred things to stay that way. Instead of responding that she didn't want anything, Arthur mentions that his life now was wonderful, compared to when he was in the real capital, when he didn't even make important memories. That's why he was always having fun to the point of it feeling like a dream. And Micah insists they can do anything now to make his life even better. She would love to get closer to Ash, but sometimes he gets so distracted with what he's doing that he doesn't pay attention to others. Arthur understands how that feels, as the protagonist gets busy to the point of not even responding. However, that part of him that strives to push his own limits was one of his qualities. Certainly, Ash would guide them through various experiments and new experiences so they could make incredible memories. It could be challenging, but even if Arthur gets into trouble, he knew the others would be there to help him if needed. Micah agreed and promised she wouldn't lose to him in any way. Quickly, she wraps up the conversation and pulls him by the hand so they can meet Ash again. Back in the dormitory, the protagonist notices that those two were getting along so well that they were holding hands. At the same time, he feels relieved to see that his friend seemed to be feeling better now. Micah stammers for having worried them and changes the subject so they can focus on the tasks they still had to do. In that, Arthur comments that although he asked Rin for help, she requested a bit more time to get the information, so they would probably have to refocus on the experiments with composite materials. Thus, the protagonist and Micah head out to the garden to check on the situation. This time, Ash was trying to make a new formula using bones, and the idea was to test its effectiveness. In the distance, some students gossip about what they were doing and laugh at how disgusting it was. The kids call them poor for coming from the countryside and staining the school's image. Right away, Micah stands up to confront the students who said mean things, and the protagonist tries to calm her down since they didn't need to worry too much about them. None of that bothered him, so instead, they should continue their task in the garden. Even as time passed and they returned to school, Micah still thought they should do something about those rude students. It was possible they would continue to bother them later, but the protagonist didn't care about that now and thought it was better to leave them aside. His friend was impressed by how he didn't get irritated by such situations. Ash replies that if they could at least have a real conversation, it would be one thing, but since they were just talking nonsense, none of that matters now. That was the main reason it was a waste of time dealing with people like that. Micah understands what the boy meant and asks him not to worry because she would take care of the situation. Later, in the dining hall, she called the students to talk and thanked them for allowing them to have a study session from now on. Aware of Yuika's advice, the girl was determined to face those problems head-on. The study group was proposed so that classmates could regularly discuss the time they spend at the academy. It was the kind of activity that Micah intended to use to deal with those delinquents by increasing Ash's allies and supporters. To start, she knew there were some in the room who didn't usually interact much with each other. And since they were all gathered, she asked a boy named Glenn to introduce himself first. This guy was a knight who wasn't good at studying, so being invited there made him quite happy and hopeful that he could improve. Micah praised him for always being impressive during martial training classes. Next to introduce himself was Silas Saula, who came from a family of farmers from a village. There was also K. Ganesh, who came from merchants. The others continued to introduce themselves, and lastly, the one who spoke his own name was Hermes. Finally, Micah asked everyone to put in their best effort and started the study session. Sometime later, they concluded the day's lessons and the students went home. It seemed that their meeting had indeed proven effective against the delinquents. Mordo and his friends had difficulties approaching Ash and provoking him like before. The protagonist was amazed by the study materials prepared by his friend and praised her for becoming so good at teaching. During the conversation, Micah noticed that there were two girls talking and asked if either of them still had questions about any topic. Kay got nervous and replied that it was nothing like that, until she slowly decided to ask anyway. The girl heard from her family that the merchant guild impacted the rising thefts and law-breaking. This year, there was less food distribution for those living in the outer quadrant, and Kay wondered if some had opted to steal because they were starving. This topic caught Ash's attention, who asked for more details about it. The outer quadrant was a place where poor people lived. Usually, there was food distribution coming from the temple or the lord of the city, but this year no one had purchased goods. Kay stammered that the merchant guild was only murmuring about how the thieves were affecting business. However, the topic left the protagonist reflective. Ash went to meet Belgo and thanked him for his hard work with the organic compounds. He took the opportunity to ask if any problems had arisen in recent days, but nothing seemed to have happened. However, from Belgo's expression, the protagonist suspected that something else was bothering him, and the carpenter shared that some people had come to talk to him, and they were all from the outer quadrant. The residents heard that the condemned were receiving food in exchange for work and wanted to know if they could save a little. However, it wasn't as if there was enough food for themselves, and at first, the carpenter refused the proposal. Ash reflected on what he heard from Kay and realized that the information was consistent. The problem was that even if they wanted to, they couldn't make their garden produce more food than it already did, and Belgo mentioned that he was in great debt to the residents of the quadrant because when he was starving, they took care of him. Not only that, but his fellow condemned were helped in the same way. That was the reason the carpenter had decided to ask the protagonist if there was anything they could do to help them. Ash understood that it was normal to think this way since he was the one who came up with the idea to start reducing people's hunger. Thus, he decided he would do everything possible to find a solution to this problem. For now, Belgo and the others could continue working as usual. As expected, it was hard to ignore the idea of people collapsing from hunger, and Ash was determined to find a way to produce more food.